Chapter 491. General Zhang also smiled and continued, so we let him be. But after this, we knew that he was not very reliable and was not an excellent ally. So while keeping an eye on him we went to look for other friends. When he fought with the golden photon that night we gave him a last chance. We gave him some power and opportunity to see how far he could go. The result, as Zither Jun saw, he died. General Zhang shook his head. Since he died, it's fine. We didn't have any relationship with him, but at first we thought he was smart and could do great things if he was trained well. Since he wanted to die, we had no reason not to let him go. Until now, my master still needs an ally. It was a mistake to choose Li Yunxin. Now it is not a mistake to choose Zither Jun, therefore. Zhang Jingzhong cupped his hands. It is indeed worthy of the 4 words sincere cooperation. For this we have already shown our sincerity. Speaking of this, he raised his hand and pointed to the south. Li Yunxin previously set up a big formation in the wilderness forest, which can transform the souls of the dead into the power of wish. We know that Zither Jun and Lord Tongtian also had such an arrangement, but Wanderer Bai, who was in charge of the formation, was killed by Li Yunxin. He did this in the hope that the 2 of you could only rely on him to digest the souls of the dead. Now that he is dead, we have already repaired the formation he left in the wilderness forest. If Zither Jun and Lord Tongtian still want the power of wish from the souls of the dead, then we can use that formation. Zither Jun and Hatred were stunned when they heard this. Then Zither Jun raised her eyebrows and said with a faint smile, "So, the souls of the dead were captured by your formation?" General Zhang smiled. "That's right. They have been refined in the formation. Whenever Zither Jun and Lord Tongtian want to enjoy them, we will offer them with both hands." "But you said just now you didn't do it." General Zhang smiled again. "Indeed, I didn't do it. It was also not done by my fellows in the Li Kingdom. It was done by the 2 great shopkeepers of the Yi Kingdom and the Qin Kingdom. That's why they don't have the time. I'll be the one to talk to you." Hearing this, Zither Monarch turned to Hatred and smiled. "I see. Look, this General Zhang is eloquent and has a meticulous mind. It makes the 2 of us look stupid." Hatred also grinned. Exactly. It was a waste of talent for such an intelligent person to remain immortal. Why don't we give him eternal life? The 2 great fiendish demons were joking, but their words were filled with an intense sense of danger. It was as though they were about to attack and kill Zhang Jingzhong in a blink of an eye. General Zhang smiled and said, "Zither Lady and Lord Tong, please be patient. I have something else to say, please listen carefully." In the past, but the voice stopped abruptly. Hatred slammed his palm on the top of his skull, and his whole body immediately exploded into a pile of sticky flesh and blood. He was indeed a mortal who didn't practice Taoism. Since his physical body was destroyed, his remnant soul swayed and floated. Hatred clenched his fist again. This remnant soul was also scattered. Then he snorted, "You overestimate yourself. After we take down Cloud Mountain in a few days, we'll also wipe out this Munanju. But it's a pity for those 40 to 50,000 remnant souls." Zither Monarch smiled. "Forget it. Let's go down Cloud Mountain first. And then the remnant souls. Humph, Munanju is just Esu. They really think we have to rely on Little White. We just need to keep a close eye on them. They get stolen again." Saying this, he looked down at his feet, but it won't be enough for them. No one knew if he was looking at the Golden Horn Ho or something else. Hearing this, Hatred's expression turned cold. Then he said, "But young Dragon Master, it seems that the fake saint was seen through and the Xian men turned against each other. But they actually counterattacked just now. It seems that the Freemasonry has transferred back some of the people who were sent out. Now they have stabilized their position. In this case, we only need the remnant souls and the situation is still under control. But if we want to take down Cloud Mountain, I still want them all." Zither Monarch raised his eyebrows. "Rest for a day and a night. Then press on and lure those Taoist priests over. After that, we should kill them all. Then we will go up Cloud Mountain. At that time everything will be ours." Yazi nodded in agreement. So the huge Golden Horn Ho continued to move forward. On both sides of the ground were countless demon soldiers and generals. They could no longer see the ground, only muddy flesh and corpses. Actually, there was something else. Remnant souls. But ordinary people and demons would not open their eye for no reason. For example, at this moment if someone opened their eyes, all they could see were countless remnant souls that had died miserably standing on the ground. and there were even living beings walking among them. Forget about knowing the way. If they looked down at their palms, they would see a bloody face. Who would give themselves this trouble? So even Zither monarch in hatred did not notice that there was actually a bold ghost standing on the head of the golden horn hoe, listening to their conversation. The ghost stood there for a long time as if it had wandered here aimlessly. In fact, it was not the only one nearby. There were many other wandering souls on the hoe. Fierce battles had taken place on this land, and it had even changed hands several times. The remnant souls had become so dense that even the wind could not pass through. If Zither monarch in hatred used any magical power to detect its existence, they could erase it with a wave of their hands. But they did not. The golden horn hoe was so huge that an elephant's height could only reach its knee. The two of them were conversing on this hoe and they were in their own camp. What they were talking about wasn't anything too secretive, so how could they be on high alert at all times? Therefore, these words and scenes were all heard by this ghostly thing without missing a single word. In fact, if one observed carefully, they would find that it was not a ghost but something different. But this place was a battlefield. Large amounts of remnant souls, resentment, and spiritual power were mixed together. Even a true realm master would find it difficult to form a formation, which showed how chaotic the chi was. Usually this difference would be noticed by others. But on this battlefield he could no longer sense anything. At this moment the wandering soul suddenly became agile, turned around and jumped down. Squeezed by the other wandering souls, it quickly escaped. From here it went straight west. 60 li to the west was the remnant of the Tuotunluan mountain. The terrain was relatively steep. A camp of demon soldiers was stationed here, guarding against enemy attacks from the side. Here there were much fewer humans and demons. But the wandering soul did not stop at this sentry post. It passed through a dense forest, a swamp, and a lake. Finally, it climbed to the top of a small mountain like a wisp of smoke, and landed in the palm of a person. This person was dressed in white and was half lying on the ground. With one arm supporting his head, he looked at the densely packed humans and demons on the horizon, and also at the slowly descending Yunshan. Seeing that the wandering soul had returned, he raised his hand and slapped it. The wandering soul turned into a piece of paper and fell to the ground. It turned out that it was drawn by a painting. He held the paper in his hand and saw that it was densely packed with the conversation between the three people. After reading it, he was stunned for a while, then slowly crushed the paper and scattered it. Then he sat up straight. His face was expressionless before, but now he was a little moved. Death Warrior. Li Yunxin sighed. The words recorded on this talisman, which he had just learned from the art saint study, made him realize that even Zither Lady and Yazi believed that he had indeed perished in both body and soul. But the people of Southwood House did not think so. Therefore, when the two demons asked about the whereabouts of the remnant soul, General Zhang only said that it was captured by their people. No one would have predicted that Li Yunxin would do this. However, Zither Master and Yazi had said that this was just a immortal. His expression did not change at all. He immediately gave a reasonable explanation to the two monsters, and then he was obliterated. He couldn't have thought that he would die, right? Thinking of this, Li Yunxin seemed to see the impassioned look of that person before he died. So he sighed again. Then he stood up. Now everyone thought he was dead. Originally, Zhang Jingzhong should have been aware of the inside story, but now he was also killed by Yazi. In this way, for a short period of time he really disappeared from this world. So he decided to die again. About an hour later, Li Yunxin appeared behind a gentle slope. This slope was not a slope of earth but a slope of corpses. It was formed by the bones of demons and cultivators. This place was northwest of the front line. It was originally a plain. The vanguard of the demon army was the first to reach here, but was attacked by the cultivators of Xianmen. The two sides fought fiercely here, but there was no way to break through, so the front line slowly moved to the east, looking for a breakthrough. However, after a while, some high-level cultivators who were sent out by the fake sage suddenly came back to help. So the vanguard was thwarted and slowly retreated. This was the place where the demon army was closest to Cloud Mountain, about 100 miles away. Li Yunxin hid behind this gentle slope and looked up at the sky. In fact, he couldn't see the sky. The whole field of vision was occupied by Cloud Mountain. Here he could hear a loud roar, the sound of Cloud Mountain falling, the sound of air being compressed, and the sound of rocks falling outside the mountain. This sound was more deafening than the fiercest thunder. Even if he roared, people one step away would not be able to hear what he said. The walls of the mountain were densely packed with caves. Those were the places where the cultivators who couldn't fly were imprisoned. Lu Gongzan was imprisoned in one of these caves, and these caves were almost the same, so it was impossible for Li Yunxin to find out which cave he was in. However, at that time, Xen Shiliu had the translucent jade slip that Li Yunxin gave her. The translucent jade slip contained the aura left by Li Yunxin, so he could roughly know the location of that thing. When he gave it to her, he had the same idea. Chapter 492. Therefore he knew that Lu Gongzan had been imprisoned in the northwest of the periphery of Cloud Mountain. Now that the situation outside was like this, he must have been moved into the mountain. And at this moment, Li Yunxin could also sense where Lu Gongzan was in the mountain. Because Lu Gongzan had something that belonged to him. When he was far away, his aura was faint and he couldn't sense it. When he was close, he could sense it again. The translucent jade slip had determined the approximate location for him. And that little thing could help him find out which room Lu Gongzan was in. But there was another problem. When he was imprisoned by Su Yusong in the Xianmen army, he had heard him mention that there was an extremely tight defense outside the Xianmen. But this defense was not carried out by people. Instead, it was a huge array that had been operating for tens of thousands of years. Cultivators above the true state could cultivate the supernatural power of transforming their souls into their true bodies. If a cultivator in the periphery of Cloud Mountain used the method of transforming his soul into his true body, with a thought his true body would appear in Cloud Mountain. Wouldn't that be a headache? This great array was designed to deal with such supernatural power. Even a cultivator at the peak of the profound realm couldn't be more than 100 miles away from his true body. Therefore, the range of this great array in Cloud Mountain was as wide as 100 miles. Even if an expert at the peak of the profound realm used his incarnation outside the array and wanted to invade, he could only stick to the outside of the mountain wall. If he wanted the incarnation to go further inside, he had to go with his true body to ensure that the incarnation wouldn't be destroyed. However, once both his true body and incarnation entered the restriction, it should be known that on the night after killing Jin Guangzi, Su Xing had told Li Yunxin. The so-called divine soul into true body didn't really mean dividing a part of the soul. The incarnation was just a projection of one's meridians and orifices. When the true body died, if the meridians and orifices of the body were gone, the incarnation would have no projection to project and would be destroyed later. It was impossible for the true body to die and the incarnation to stay. Therefore, the true body and the incarnation were like two extremes. The two extremes entered the array at the same time, and the spiritual energy in the array immediately flowed, quickly forming a reciprocating passage between the two extremes. How strong was the spiritual energy in a formation that could cover the entire Cloud Mountain? Such powerful spiritual energy was circulating wildly between his real body and his projection. It wasn't something that anyone's snow mountain or sea of chi could withstand. It didn't matter that the incarnation was illusory. However, his real body would explode bit by bit and he would die a miserable death. Thus, the sturdy outer wall of the cloudy mountain prevented any possibility of breaking in by force. The restriction outside the outer wall prevented the possibility of the incarnation directly appearing in the Cloud Mountain. Therefore, for tens of thousands of years, those low-level cultivators could be locked outside the mountain without worrying that they would be rescued from the outside. Li Yunxin was more than 100 miles away from Cloud Mountain at the moment. In fact, some of the demons had tried this method when the demon army had charged here previously. They had split their spirit bodies outside the Cloud Mountains in an attempt to break in. However, none of the cultivators from the Mystic Gate paid attention to them. They just let the demons charge toward Cloud Mountain, and then watched them slowly explode into balls of blood in the air. At that time, Li Yunxin saw that scene with his own eyes. From this, he confirmed that the restriction did exist. And now he appeared here not because he had thought of some other method, but because he planned to do the same thing. The Cloud Mountain continued to fall and the sound was like thunder. After another 15 minutes, Li Yunxin stood up. Then he shot into the sky and like a sharp arrow he shot straight toward Cloud Mountain. Between the Cloud Mountain and the ground was not an empty space. Instead, there was a thick layer of smoke and dust, huge falling rocks and lingering water vapor. But even so, even though his figure was hidden by these things, he was still seen by many cultivators from the Mystic Gate. Some had just retreated here, planning to rest and reorganize and guard Tongtian Swamp. The others were experts guarding the rear and their eyesight was better. But whether it was those low-level cultivators or experts, they only glanced at him and then looked away. In the past, it might be a new thing to see someone risking his life to rush to Cloud Mountain. But so many days had passed, so many people had died, and they had seen more stupid demons doing the same thing. Even the most hot-blooded cultivator in the realm of wills couldn't bring himself to do it. Everyone wanted to restore more Wacken as soon as possible to face the second round of attacks launched by demons. And the experts had other more troublesome things to do. These experts were all from the Freemasonry who came from everywhere later. The two fake sages came out of Cloud Mountain in advance, but they revealed their flaws, which led to the decadence of the battle again and again. Many cultivators from the Mystic Gate who should have died in the battle at the last moment left in advance. Now they, the wandering souls of the Freemasonry who had possessed the bodies of the head of masters and leaders, had to take over the work of those people and fight against the demons. How could this be? How could this be consuming the power of the Mystic Gate? It was obviously consuming the power of the Freemasonry. Therefore Xianxia, who was not paid attention to by these people, rushed to 30 miles away from Cloud Mountain. 30 miles. When he was fighting with Fu Lifang in Dongting, he was in the realm of enlightened immortal, and the real body transformed by the spirit could be 30 miles away from the original body. Now he had reached the realm of advanced immortal and he could be 50 or 60 miles away. He sensed that Lu Gongzan was in the mountain about 50 miles away from here. In the rumbling rain of stones, in the pervading steam, and in the deafening noises that seemed to never stop, Xianxia gritted her teeth and roared, "Go!" He transformed into his real body and appeared 50 miles away from Cloud Mountain. At the same time he felt terrible pain. Wacken began to surge wildly into his body. It was as if countless steel awls were pouring into his body and began to pierce every meridian and acupoint of him. The pain not only came from the body but also from the deepest part of the soul. This level of pain finally made him understand why the great fiendish demons of MT Soaring Cloud had howled fiercely. The next moment, a layer of golden mist began to spread around his body. But it was not light, it was the golden dragon blood in his body. The more he moved forward, the faster his body collapsed. In just 3 seconds, the flesh and skin of his body, which had just been reborn for one night, began to peel off, blood splashed and bones shattered. He was about to be destroyed again. Some cultivators on the ground occasionally looked up and witnessed this process. They could not see clearly, but they could only see a human figure disintegrating and dispersing quickly. They all knew that it was a big demon. However, after the figure finally burst into a thick cloud of fire, they retracted their gaze. It was just another idiot who had died. Lu Gongzan was in a stone room at the moment. There was still no chain on his body, so he just fell to the ground. Lying on his side, he could see the swordsman outside the door with his blank eyes. Now his face was covered in bloody scars. Some of them were injured by the swordsman's scabbard on the stone path. The other part was some ulcers. His body was so weak that it was on the verge of collapse. Because of the terrible inflammation on his right arm and because he had not eaten for a long time, the vitality in his body had reached the point where it was about to end. But he did not know what made him hold back his breath so that he could survive. The swordsman stared at him with disgust for a while outside the cell door and said again, "I know that look in your eyes. It's because your body is in extreme pain and you want to end this pain as soon as possible, but you can't do it. So you look at me, you want to die, don't you?" He sneered and shook his head. "I won't let you die. Dino, last night, my sect leader died in battle." A perfected Taoist who had cultivated for more than 300 years died in the hands of demons. Sect leader treated me. Bah. He gritted his teeth and spat into the room. "You are a scum among people. Associating with demons. If you were fine now, I would immediately kill you to avenge sect leader. But now that you are in so much pain, I won't kill you, I won't let you do what you want. I will let you experience the feeling of living a life worse than death. Bah." But that Lao Dao did not say anything. He just lay on the ground and opened his mouth subconsciously, like a fish that had jumped onto the shore. The swordsman frowned again and cursed in a low voice, "You deserve this." But after saying this, he suddenly felt a cold breeze blow past him. Then he seemed to see a shadow pass by. But now they were in the dungeon. Although the stone path was wide, it was extremely dark. This dungeon had not been locked up for a long time, and there was not much spiritual energy left in the Chongming talisman, so the light was slightly flickering. So, he did not take it to heart. This place was the inner part of Cloud Mountain. It was at least 20 miles away from the outside. He heaved a sigh of relief and suppressed the restlessness in his heart. Then he turned to look at the dungeon. Then, like a statue, he stood rooted to the ground. In the dungeon, a blurry figure was slowly taking shape. At first he thought that Lao Dao had died and he did not know how. He opened his eye so he saw the remnant of his soul. But as soon as this thought appeared in his mind, he realized that it was not a remnant of his soul. It was just a transparent silhouette. He could see that the silhouette bent down in front of Lu Gongzan and touched his right arm. Then, he saw that the terrible wound on Lu Gongzan's right arm was torn open by the silhouette. There was originally a wound on his forearm, but many festering cracks spread out from that wound to his upper and lower body. Now that the wound on his forearm was torn open, what was inside was revealed. It was a palm-sized scale. The transparent silhouette picked up the scale and pressed it on his chest. Like a halo, the silhouette turned from transparent to solid. In the end, it turned into a handsome, devilishly charming man dressed in white. He tilted his head and glanced at the swordsman. He bent down and held Lu Gongzan in his arms as he said softly, "If that's the case, I'll send you to see your sect leader, okay?" Chapter 493. Such a low voice reached the sword cultivator's ears in the dark stone path. But the sword cultivator didn't move at all. It wasn't because he was scared out of his wits, but it was precisely because his brain felt as if thousands of needles were stabbing into it at the same time. Cold sweat seeped down his spine like rain, and every muscle in his body was so tense that it was about to snap. But he still didn't move, because she had already realized that this white-robed, beautiful, calm man exuded a towering evil aura. Was the Dragon Nine Cheese Kiss, the Wei River Dragon King and Li Yunxin. But wasn't he already dead? This sentence turned crazily in his mind. He silently shouted it hundreds of times, but he still didn't dare to move. Such a cruel demon could come back to life under the eyes of all the cultivators in the world. The demon was less than 2 feet away from him. How could he dare to move? How could he dare to run? So he continued to stand still, looking at Li Yunxin. First he tore the Taoist robe on Lu Gongzan's right arm and threw it aside. Then he said lightly, "If you dare to run, I will tear you apart." The swordsman immediately nodded crazily. He didn't care if Li Yunxin could see him or not. Li Yunxin stretched out his hand and pressed the wound on Lu Gongzan's right arm back. When he showed up, Lu Gongzan was already unconscious. Now that he was being tortured like this, he only let out a low groan and kept his eyes closed. His right arm was no longer swollen, but the crisscrossing cracks were still there and blood was oozing out. Looking at it, it looked just like scales. So Li Yunxin frowned slightly and used his finger to poke his arm a few times. His silver teeth moved and he bit the tip of his tongue and spat a mouthful of blood on his arm. How could his blood be ordinary blood? Even gold and stone would be corroded by it. But when it sprayed on Lu Gongzan's arm, it only gave off a faint green smoke. Then, the crisscrossing wounds on his arm began to shrink and the skin in between became hard and swollen. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. In just 2 breaths of time, the green smoke dissipated and the wound on his arm disappeared. But the crisscrossing marks were still there. However, it was no longer a crack. Instead, it was the gap between the scarlet scales. Lu Gongzan's entire arm was covered in scales. At this time, Li Yunxin asked again, "Do you have any medicinal pills?" The sword Xiu knew that she was asking him. He wanted to reply, yes, but he found that his throat and tongue were as hard as iron, so he couldn't say a word. At that moment he could only frantically search his body. After finding a few items, he lifted his leg and was about to walk over to deliver them. However, it was as if his legs were filled with lead. He only took 1 step before falling to the ground, causing the small jade bottles to fall into the cell door. Li Yunxin stretched out his hand and grabbed at the ground. He didn't care what kind of medicinal pills they were. He pulled out all of them and poured them all down Lu Gongzan's throat. He then pressed hard on his chest, and made him swallow all of them. Seeing this, the sword Xiu became anxious. He could finally speak. "You can't do this, you can't do this. The medicinal effects will clash and he will die." It wasn't that he felt sorry for Lu Gongzan. Instead, he was afraid that these medicinal pills would kill him, and the demon would become violent and vent its anger on him. But Li Yunxin didn't care about him. Instead, he used his palm strength and fiercely hit Lu Gongzhan's chest. Lu Gongzhan immediately let out a choking sound, and woke up. When he woke up and opened his eyes, he saw Li Yunxin. He was stunned for a while and then his lips trembled. "Brother X, am I dreaming?" Li Yunxin smiled gently and then helped him sit on the ground. "No." Lu Gongzhan stared at Li Yunxin for a while and said as if he was sleepwalking, "I heard that your body and soul were destroyed in front of the formation." Li Yunxin turned his face and glanced at the sword Xiu. The sword Xiu was sitting on the ground, paralyzed. Seeing Li Yunxin's gaze, he hurriedly shouted, It's all nonsense. I heard it from someone else. But Li Yunxin only said, "I want to talk to him and I don't want others to hear it." The sword Xiu was stunned for a while and blinked his eyes in disbelief. He turned his face to the side. Then I don't want you to leave my sight," Li Yunxin said coldly and stared at him without blinking. The sword Xiu was stunned again and his mouth was half open in a daze. After a breath's time, Li Yunxin raised his eyebrows. "Since you're so stupid, why don't you just die?" But as soon as he finished speaking, the sword Xiu turned his hand and pulled the hairpin out of his head. He closed his eyes and gritted his teeth, left, right, and in an instant 2 streaks of blood spurted out. He had actually pierced his ears and made him deaf. Li Yunxin smiled coldly. "At least you're not stupid." Then he turned his face to look at Lu Gongzhan, and his expression softened and he said seriously, "I'll tell you something." He also sat down cross-legged in front of Lu Gongzhan and looked at him. "I did die in front of the 2 armies. The one who died was indeed my original body. As for how I didn't die, I'll tell you." Lu Gongzhan's lips moved. But Li Yunxin raised a finger to his lips and looked at him seriously. "Listen." The old Taoist was stunned. Then he stopped talking and only listened carefully. "When I was in the city of Wei, I used the city of Wei as a formation and gathered the power of wish and yang qi just to draw another me. You know, after a person dies, his body is destroyed and his spirit is damaged, so what is left is a remnant soul. Although it looks like my former self, my mind is not complete. Just like those ghost cultivators, they have obsessions. Obsessions are a terrible flaw. Once they are controlled, it is equivalent to being held in the hands of others. So many cultivators would rather have their body and soul destroyed than become ghost cultivators. I don't want to fall into this situation. So, I used the formation in the city of Wei to ensure that my mind is not destroyed." Li Yunxin said to Lu Gongzhan seriously and carefully, "Then I used this spirit that is no different from me to attach to the reverse scale left by Qi, took over his body and replaced him as Long Jiu. That was how I lived in the city of Wei. But later this method was seen through by the Freemasonry. In fact, I didn't want to hide it for too long. This method was not difficult, but no one had done it before, so no one could have thought of it. Now that I did it, no matter how well I hid it, it would be found out sooner or later. Since it would be found out sooner or later, it would be better for me to maximize its value before that. So I deliberately left a large formation in the wilderness forest that could draw my spirit. But I never thought of using this formation. It was big but not big enough. In the end, it was still discovered by the Freemasonry. When they found this, they thought they had found my trump card, which was the result I wanted. Then everyone thought I had no way out. My original body was planted with a restriction, and the large formation for resurrection was also exposed. After that, I disguised myself for a long time, just to dispel any suspicion of anyone, to make them believe that I was really at the end of my road. But when you and I were in the Ziwei Palace in Dongting and were bombarded by the heavenly thunder of several sects, you should still remember. I used the Dragon Palace to escape, and the Dragon Palace naturally stayed where it was. That Ming Zhenzi didn't notice a small copper nail, so I hid it in the soil. Then I led the flood dragon in the lake to lure them away, and I came back to kill them. They thought we were arguing and I told you to go, but you didn't go. But in fact, you threw the palace in the soil to me and I threw a scale to you. So I got the Dragon Palace back and things were easy." Li Yunxin let out a sigh of relief. In front of the 2 armies, I drove the copper nail into the ground. Then I left my real body in the Dragon Palace. One of them was the other scale that I had left behind. By the death of my original body. At the moment of my death, there was another emptiness in the world. And when the original body died, The incarnation would exist for a very short period of time as a projection of the original body. Thus, my avatar immediately attached itself to that scale, and another one of me was born. Since it was my soul incarnation, it naturally had a consciousness unlike those remnant souls. This was why I survived even though my body and soul were destroyed in front of the array. Then I came to this cloud mountain. First, I sacrificed my incarnation inside the cloud mountain, and then my true self came to the cloud mountain. The great formation outside the mountain then destroyed my new true self and spirit. Then my incarnation came to you again, obtained this scale from you and reconstructed the third true self. When Li Yunxin said this, he paused and looked at Lu Gongzan. The me in front of you is already the third me. In these 2 days I happened to die twice. When he said this, he shook his head and laughed at himself. But like I said to you before in the city of Wei, a man should be more ruthless to himself. Am I right? He laughed like this, but Lu Gongzan didn't laugh. He stared at Li Yunxin and listened to his most private things. His lips trembled again and he squeezed out a hoarse voice from his throat. Brother Exa, why do you say all these things? Li Yunxin lowered his eyes. After a moment of silence, he looked at him again and said calmly, "You know, I don't like to talk about things in my heart." He thought for a while and smiled. "Anyway, I don't like to reveal my true feelings to each other." Lu Gongzan. It was the first time he saw him smile like this. He looked like a shy child. Li Yunxin smiled like this, then shook his head and restrained his expression. He looked at Lu Gongzan solemnly again. "So I told you these things. From now on there are no more secrets between us." In this dim stone prison the two sat facing each other. Inside Cloud Mountain there was a chaotic atmosphere. Outside Cloud Mountain there was a bloody massacre. But in this small and quiet stone room, one of the masterminds behind all this, Wei River Dragon King Li Yunxin, and Lu Gongzan sat facing each other in silence, looking at each other. Lao Dao shut his mouth tightly, his chest slightly rising and falling. After another 3 breaths, his throat moved as if he had swallowed something. "I understand," he said. "Brother X and I understand." Chapter 494. Li Yunxin was silent for a while. Then he heaved a sigh of relief and stood up. "Then, let's talk about another matter." He looked at Lu Gongzan. "Your right arm could not be saved. The scale has my demonic energy, the demonic energy of the true state. Even if it's just a scale, it's still slowly eroding your vitality after you hit it in your flesh and blood. So, I used some tricks just now to seal the demonic energy of the dragons in your right arm." At this point, Lu Gongzan lowered his head to look at his arm. It wasn't that he didn't notice it before, but he didn't mention it. Now that Li Yunxin mentioned it, he slowly raised his right arm and clenched it. The scale covered the back of his hand. As he clenched it, the sound of metal clashing could be heard. It was demonic, but it was very powerful. Your right arm has the demonic energy of the dragons, so it's very strong, comparable to ordinary magic weapons. Li Yunxin sighed. "I had no other way, so I could only do this. I don't know if you... I like it very much." Lu Gongzan smiled. "It's a good arm. It's both an arm and a divine weapon. Brother Xen, give it a name." Li Yunxin was silent for a while. He exhaled lightly and suddenly smiled. "Let's call it Qilin arm," Lu Gongzan thought for a while. "It's a good arm and a good name." After saying this, he slowly stood up and moved his arms and legs. He said in a low voice, "It's still a little sore, but I'm full of energy. What does Brother Xian want to do next? After being imprisoned here for so long, my old bones are also itching." But Li Yunxin didn't move. He only looked at him. "Don't be anxious. There's one more thing. The vitality in your body was originally going to be cut off. In order to save your life, I randomly gave you a handful of pills. I didn't ask for any medicinal properties, just the spiritual energy inside. You feel energetic now, but the spiritual energy is supporting you. If the spiritual energy dissipates, you won't be able to live. We'll save your life first, then we'll do other things." When he said this, Lu Gongzan smiled and was about to say something. But Li Yunxin waved his hand. "I know what you're going to say. But since we're on Cloud Mountain now, it's not difficult to save your life, as long as I enter Cloud Mountain first." After saying this, he turned to look at the sword cultivator outside the prison cell. The swordsman himself had become deaf. He was shivering in pain, but he didn't dare to groan. He just stood there as if his feet were rooted to the ground. Li Yunxin looked at him sternly and ordered, "Open the door." These words directly bombard into the sword cultivator's spiritual sense. However, this kind of sound transmission method was simple and crude, and it was harmful to one's divine sense. Li Yunxin was at the perfected master realm. When she spoke in such a manner, the sword cultivator only felt his head buzzing. It was as if a god was speaking with the sound of thunder. Every sentence he heard made him dizzy. He knew that Li Yunxin didn't need him to open the door. But when he heard Li Su's words, he was relieved. If Li Su wanted to kill him, he probably wouldn't be so long-winded. But now Li Su told him to do this and that. Obviously, Li Su didn't want to kill him. But when he heard Li Su's words, he was relieved. If Li Su wanted to kill him, he probably wouldn't be so long-winded. But Li Su told him to do this and that. Obviously, Li Su didn't want to kill him. As for opening the door, Li Su wanted to order him around and show off his power. So he endured the pain in his head, took out the key and opened the door. Instead he said, "Let me ask you first, do you know where the other person is imprisoned?" If an ordinary cultivator were to encounter such a situation and face such a demon, they would definitely be at a loss for what to do after poking their ears and feeling dizzy. But this sword cultivator seemed to be smarter than ordinary people. Hearing Li Yunxin's question rumbling in his mind, he only paused for a moment before replying, I know. The Dragon King is talking about another demon cultivator, a chicken spirit. I know where he is, he's not far from here." Li Yunxin said, "Lead the way." The sword cultivator didn't dare to say anything else. He turned around and led the way. Li Yunxin followed him. Lu Gongzan thought for a while and slowly followed. This place was used to imprison prisoners. Wide and cold stone paths connected the cells. They were illuminated by talismans that didn't have much spiritual power. The three of them walked on the stone path. Their footsteps echoed far away. After about half an incense stick of time, Li Yunxin said, "I'll kill you here." But he didn't say it with his spiritual sense. The sword cultivator didn't notice and didn't stop. Lu Gongzan was stunned. He said in a low voice, "Brother Exen?" Li Yunxin slowed down her pace and walked alongside Lu Gongzan. "If he doesn't behave in a moment, you take action and kill him. If you meet other cultivators below the realm of truth, you can kill them. Your Kylan arm is impervious to fire and water. I'll be behind you in such a narrow place. No one will be a match for you." Lu Gongzan frowned. He knew that Li Yunxin's shout was to test the sword cultivator to see if he was deaf or not. And now he said something like this, "I'm only in the realm now. I don't have any demon power." Li Yunxin said softly, "I had a guess about the body possession after death." He said slowly while walking, "Since the body is destroyed and the body is possessed by the incarnation, and the incarnation is a projection, it might have some effect. I didn't notice it in the city of Wei. But I felt it on the battlefield. After the third time, I'm finally sure." As he spoke, he raised his hand and rubbed it hard on his face. After his first possession, he still looked like Li Yunxin. His appearance had matured early, and he looked 18 or 19 at the age of 15 or 16. He looked like a handsome and devilishly handsome young man. The second time he was resurrected on the battlefield, his appearance didn't change, but he looked more fresh and tender. His skin was like a newborn baby's. If any mortal woman in the world saw him, they would probably feel ashamed of themselves and think that their skin was rotten. Now, after the third possession, his skin was even more delicate and smooth. Now he rubbed his face hard and put his hand down. His face immediately turned red. But it was not a healthy red. It looked like it had been exposed to the sun or hit hard. After another breath of time, the red color gradually turned green, and then into a deep purple. Under the skin of his face, he rubbed it until it bled. Lu Gongzan was shocked and whispered, "How can this be?" He had been with Li Yunxin for a long time, so he knew a lot about demons. For example, this dragon child was not an ordinary animal to begin with. He was formed by the dragon's soul and the demon's primordial qi. He had no original form. Whether it was the human form, the demon form, or the real body, they could all be seen as different forms of the original form. Because of this, once the spirit was damaged or weakened, it would show on the face. Li Yunxin's body had always been strong. A knife couldn't even cut an eyelash. But now he just rubbed his face with his hand, and blood appeared. "Many have died. I guess the spirit is damaged." Li Yunxin whispered, "After the possession there is no demon power, only the realm. Originally, without demon power only the body is strong. But now it seems that there is something wrong with the body. But, it's just a matter of face. The phrase "a matter of face" was ambiguous and could be interpreted in any way. But just as Lu Gongzan was puzzled, Li Yunxin raised her hand again. A few fingers of her right hand turned into the form of a demon, and her nails became sharp. Then he used his fingernails to scratch the blood, and cut off half the size of a palm. Lu Gongzan's scalp tightened and he almost felt his face hurt. But the skin peeled off, but there was no blood. Below it was the skin of a newborn baby, very smooth and tender. Li Yunxin rubbed the skin in his hand and it turned into powder. Now it's easy to lose the skin, but it's not a big problem. But before I recover my demon power, I'm afraid that people will see through me. So if anything happens I will have to rely on you. Lu Laodao listened to him and nodded. Then he sighed, Brother Xe, it can't die again. Something happens. Li Yunxin smiled. Oh, if I die again today I won't die again. Lu Gongzan was stunned again and he didn't understand what he meant. The swordsman in front stopped, turned around and looked at Li Yunxin and Lu Gongzan. We're here. When he spoke he looked a little panicked and it seemed that he was trying his best to stay awake. After saying this he stepped aside, and a stone room appeared next to him. The place where Xianxia was imprisoned was not far from the place where Lu Gongzan was imprisoned, and the cell was also the same. But the person lying on the ground looked more miserable than Lu Gongzan. He was lying on the stone floor, motionless. His left arm was gone and there were white bones at the broken part. A pool of black blood flowed on the ground and it had already scabbed. No one knew how long he had been lying like this. His hair was messy and half of his face was covered, but his face could be vaguely seen. He was indeed a chicken spirit. His body didn't move and no one knew whether he was dead or alive. Seeing this, Li Yunxin pursed his lips and stopped. Lu Gongzan strode forward, grabbed the cell door with his right hand and tore it open with a bit of force. Then he walked in, squatted down and put his hand on his neck for a while. He turned to look at Li Yunxin. He has 6 hours at most. Li Yunxin was silent for a while, and then he turned to look at the swordsman. Do you know where Bai Yunxin and Red Lady are? The swordsman was stunned for a while. I don't know. But, then do you know where Xianxia is? The swordsman was even more stunned. Xianxia? Who is she? Li Yunxin walked over and said, Okay. It's none of your business. Then you stay here and take good care of them. The swordsman was slightly relieved. Dragon King, don't worry. Li Yunxin suddenly raised his hand and hit his head with his palm. The swordsman reacted and raised his sword to block. But there was a sound of metal cracking. The sword was smashed and the bones were broken. The arms and head were smashed. The swordsman fell to the ground without a sound. A remnant soul slowly stood up from the corpse. Li Yunxin breathed a sigh of relief, bowed his head and rubbed his palm, so the wound caused by the broken sword healed quickly. He squatted down, dipped his hand in the swordsman's blood, drew a few lines on the ground and breathed again. The remnant soul suddenly opened its eyes wide and slowly appeared, looking no different from the previous swordsman. Li Yunxin glanced at Pheasant and said to Lu Gongzan, Let him deal with the corpse. It can hold on for a while. Wait for me here, I'll save you in 6 hours. Without waiting for Lu Gongzan's reply, he flew off into the distance. Chapter 495. The two pseudo-sages seemed to be unaware of all this. But even if they knew, compared to what was happening inside Cloud Mountain, Su Yusong and Zhuomuzhe seemed to think that what was happening outside Cloud Mountain was more of a headache for them. For example, now a group of mortals crawling in front of them, shivering. Now they were in a palace which looked brilliant and extraordinarily gorgeous. This was supposed to be the style of a mortal emperor. But now a group of detached and indifferent cultivators in this palace seemed a little out of place. But this was something that could not be helped. Cloud Mountain fell 100 miles away and the terrible noise shook the earth violently. Without the protection of this ostentatious magic treasure, these mortals would probably be shocked to death in just a quarter of an hour. But this group of mortals was the group of people who could not die the most now. Su Yusong stared at them for a while, almost gnashing his teeth as he looked at the group of heads standing in front of him. This is what you did. Yes, they were just wandering souls. Some of these wandering souls were originally guarding in the wild forest, in case the people of Munanju caused trouble before Li Yunxin died. Some were guarding the emperors and ministers of various countries, in case they killed themselves to become ghost cultivators. The original intention was to send these people to a safer place. After the war, those heads who had not been possessed died or were seriously injured, and then they would completely take over the entire Xianmen Gate. But many things looked and did were all different things. How could Zhou Xian and Zhou Xian know that they had been seen through the first time they appeared in the world? In fact, they could not be blamed. If those heads still had the mind of mortals, they would never think that the two sages may not be the two sages of the past. Because mortals always had many habits and emotions. Naturally, they included things like fear and respect. These things would always blind the clear consciousness of mortals. But those masters had already abandoned most of these things. When what he saw and what he was thinking about were connected, he would directly omit a lot of miscellaneous emotions. Although this often made them appear paranoid, arbitrary, and headstrong, it also made it easier for them to get to the truth of the matter. The two pseudo-sages had never experienced this for 1,000 or even thousands of years. Now that they had experienced it for the first time, they ended up in such a sorry state. That was why he hurriedly gave the order to the wandering souls that were scattered elsewhere to immediately take care of their own affairs and return as soon as possible. The wandering souls returned in time, which showed how high the prestige of these two senior brothers and senior sisters were in their hearts. 35 wandering souls, including 9 holy masters and 24 sect leaders, all rushed back. After the cultivators of the Celestial Gate knew the truth, 7 or 8 of them left first. These people were disheartened and felt that the Celestial Gate had been destroyed. They didn't want to fight any more pointless battles, so they immediately abandoned the fruit of fate and went somewhere else to cultivate in seclusion. He walked away in an incomparably confident and decisive manner. There were also some who had chased after the two for a long time, but it was only for the sake of the Xianmen and the Tao's schemes. Although Zhou Xian and Zhou Xian lacked magical powers, they still had the skin of a saint. After delaying for a long time, these wandering souls arrived. Therefore, after a series of battles, some of the masters of the Celestial Gate died, some were seriously injured, and some felt that they had done their best. Heaven's will was not something they could disobey, and the Celestial Gate had run out of strength. So they also left. In this way, in the eyes of the two pseudo-sages, apart from the fact that they were unwilling to obediently hand over their bodies but also unwilling to obediently die, these high-level cultivators were still very likable. At least they were not as difficult to deal with as Li Yunxin, who had died with great difficulty. Then the internal strife ended and this group of people entered the battlefield again to fight with the great demons, making the already declining battle situation cheer up again, and once again forcing the demon army to a distance of hundreds of miles away from Cloud Mountain. Then, they saw the situation in front of them. When they rushed to the hall, Zhou Xian and Zhou Xian found out. The wandering souls had also brought a group of mortals. There were more than 100 people in total, most of them were men and very few were women. Now they were crawling in front of the two saints of Cloud Mountain, trembling and not even daring to raise their heads. In the lives of these people before, most of them were in the position of the two saints of Cloud Mountain. They were the emperors, empresses, famous nobles and ministers of the various countries in Midland. There were 119 people in total. They had originally sent some Celestial Gate cultivators to watch over them. After the incident with the Qing Emperor and Emperor Yu, they felt that the Celestial Gate cultivators did not know how to be flexible, so they sent the wandering souls to help. Earlier, the two pseudo-sages had told them to immediately take care of their own affairs and return as quickly as possible. These wandering souls unexpectedly they captured them and brought them back. Therefore Zhou Xian shouted harshly again, "Is this how you do the things I gave you? Capture all of them? What do you want me to do with them?" In the hearts of mortals, the Sendo were noble and ethereal beings. But now these noblest people in Midland found that these Sendo in front of them not only knew how to capture people, but they also knew how to curse, beat and even kill people. Each of them had a faint smell of blood on them. It came from the two arrogant emperors. They had been directly blasted into a bloody mist. Not even their souls were left. He was so angry that finally one of the wandering souls couldn't help but say, "Why don't you tell me what else can we do? If we leave them there, who knows if those stupid Taoist priests won't be able to keep an eye on them. The Qing Emperor and Emperor Yu are examples." After this person spoke, the other also said, "It's not good to kill them all. Didn't we kill one earlier? We were scolded again. Since we can't kill them or keep them, what else can we do if we don't bring them to you? These two were talking back, but their words were full of grievance. They were not arrogant. At most they were complaining. Since this was the case, Su Yusong's anger could not explode again. 35 people had rushed over and fought with the Celestial Gate cultivators. In the end they lost 2 in the first encounter. Then 3 more died. Of the 35 people only 30 remained. In total they had only killed 1 Celestial Gate sect leader and heavily injured 1 sect leader. It was not good to get angry before appeasing them. Zhuomuxia sighed lightly. Your senior brother is also angry. This matter is troublesome. When they spoke they did not avoid the nobles at all. They just pretended they didn't understand human language. Have been brought here. There are demons in front, and behind the formation are these people who could become demons at any time. Once something happens it will not be a joke. The other Zhuomuxia walked to Su Yusong's side and pulled him to sit down. He then turned to the group of wandering souls and said, didn't we say it before? When the Celestial Gate collapsed we still had to protect the world. Now that you have captured them and the world knows, what do we do in the future? The wandering souls seemed to have long known what the 2 false saints were thinking. They had no choice in this matter, so they didn't speak for a moment. After a moment of silence, they suddenly heard a thin female voice say from the corner, what's so difficult about it? Kill them one by one and wait to become ghost emperors. Once they become ghost emperors, they will be imprisoned and refined into wandering souls. Then they will be sent back to be emperors and empresses. To the outside world they will only say that the Celestial Gate fought against the demons. The immortals took them away and invited them to watch the battle so that they could see the painstaking efforts of the Celestial Gate to raise the people. This nonsense has been said for tens of thousands of years and they never get tired of it. What's the big deal if we continue now? When the nobles heard this, they trembled in fear and crouched even lower. The wandering souls looked in the direction of the voice. They saw Xianxia covered in blood. She hugged her legs and rested her chin on her knees. She looked at the mortals faintly and said these words in a very calm tone. They also knew that this little junior sister was the favorite of their senior brother and sister. But now they found it strange. She was in such a sorry state and was no longer as clever and cheerful as before. It was as if she had seen through the world of mortals and didn't care about anything. Then they looked at their senior brother and sister. Xianxia said these words and looked so sorry, but the 2 of them didn't look at her. They just kept a straight face and thought for a moment. What do you think? The wandering souls knew that something had happened between them. But they didn't say anything and just said, little junior sister is right. Su Yusong's face was gloomy. Then let's do this. Now the situation is gradually stabilizing. After watching for a day or 2 I will go back to Cloud Mountain with your senior sister. But it's not enough to just stabilize the situation. We have to kill all the demons. Since Dragon Sun is so arrogant, let them see the power of the Grand Supreme Realm. Now, let them live for a few days first. When such sinister and vicious words came out of Sendu's mouth, it immediately made the nobles understand that things were indeed not good. More than 100 people knelt down, almost covering the entire hall. Previously they had held their breath and didn't dare to breathe. Now that there was no hope in their hearts, they suddenly became noisy. But the noise only lasted for a moment. Su Yusong waved his sleeve, and these people shrank like dolls in the hands of a child and were put into his sleeve. No wonder the emperors wanted supernatural powers and longevity. Just like that, so what if they had the most power in a country? In the face of power that didn't belong to the human world, the emperor was no different from an ordinary peddler. At this moment Xianxia suddenly turned to look at Su Yusong and Zhuomuxia, then looked at the group of wandering souls and said, reason? What reason? This kind of thing that can be thought of with a little bit of brain is worthy of the word reason. She looked at the 2 fake saints with resentment. Then why do you have to refine them into wandering souls? Why don't you get someone to possess them and become emperors yourselves? And then annex those messy small vassal states, leaving only 20 to 30 lords in the world, okay? That way our people will be the respected elders of the Xianmen in a country and the emperors who live forever. Isn't that better than giving them to some demons for nothing? In the past, the countries in the human world didn't dare to annex because the Xianmen were still there. Now that the Xianmen are gone, what's there to be afraid of? Isn't this method better than refining all these people into wandering souls? Will the elders allow it? How long will it take to refine them? She said these words in one breath, and all the wandering souls in the hall were dumbfounded. Su Yusong and Zhuamuji's expressions became even worse, as if they knew what she was going to say next. Sure enough, your heads can't compare to Li Yunxin. Xianxia could no longer remain calm. It was as if there was a burning flame in her heart that had been temporarily frozen just now. But now that it was thawing bit by bit, it became even more intense. They say that you have to think about the world and achieve great things. Humph, those who achieve great things don't bother about trifles. If you really think that a person is useful, you have to use him no matter how hateful he is. Not to mention that he has been refined into a wandering soul. Why would you care about what he was like in the past? Li Yunxin, you don't refine him but killed him for nothing. Now you're refining these useless things. He's right. The two of you are more suitable to plot behind the scenes. You're not suitable at all to be the rulers of the world. At this point she stood up and glared at the two saints. I'm the one who regrets being a wandering soul and being with you. As soon as she finished speaking, everyone hurriedly said, Little junior sister, what are you saying? Wandering souls naturally had different personalities. For a moment, some were comforting, some were resentful, some were silent, and some were thoughtful. But Su Yusong finally looked at her. He sneered. You regret being a wandering soul? Fine. Then what do you want? Her words were filled with killing intent, and her eyes were so cold that they seemed to be covered with a layer of frost. She was not in a supreme state of mind. After coming out of the mountain, she suffered setbacks again and again. She had long accumulated anger in her chest. Li Yunxin had also said that Xianxia was only suitable for plotting behind the scenes. But at that time they were still on Little Cloud Mountain. Su Yusong only laughed it off, knowing that it was the harsh words of someone who was about to die. But now that Xianxia said it in such a situation, it hurt his heart. Now the killing intent was real and the coldness in her eyes was also real. But Xianxia did not flinch at all. Instead she glared back. Kill me the same way you killed Li Yunxin. Everyone was shocked. Zhuamuji could not help but turn to look at her. It seemed that he wanted to persuade her and Su Yusong. But in the end he did not say it. Su Yusong sneered. Fine. It was at this moment, when swords were drawn, two people suddenly fell through the door. This palace was also a magic treasure, not an ordinary residence that could be thrown in as one wished. So everyone turned to look at the door and saw two people. Both of them were very familiar with each other. One of them was a woman in white. It was Lu Ling. She used to be a genius in Xianmen. These wandering souls had possessed the sect leader and the sect leader, so they naturally knew about her. And the other one was Being grandmother. She was also a wandering soul, but she walked the world all year round, so it was not always possible to see her. But they also knew that this Being grandmother was different from them. They had possessed the bodies of the Xianmen masters and obtained their cultivation for nothing. Being grandmother's cultivation was not obtained for nothing, but she had cultivated it herself. And it was not Dao Tong or Kenzo methods but the way of painting. But now, Being grandmother was covered with blood, her face was like gold paper and she was on the verge of death. And Lu Ling fell in with her in her arms. It seemed that the two of them went all the way to the outside of this palace, and Being grandmother opened the magic treasure before she came in. Seeing this scene, no one was not shocked. Wandering souls were extremely difficult to die. Even if the body they possessed died, the wandering soul could abandon the body and go somewhere else. But now this Being grandmother was as weak as an ordinary person, as if the wandering soul in her body had been seriously injured and could not leave the body. Who had this kind of ability? Note 1. Something like this paragraph, in fact, is not earth-shattering, nor is it an exciting plot. It is just a side description of some characters in the novel. Perhaps many readers who see similar words in the novel will feel long-winded, or even directly skip it, and then feel a little watery. In fact, when I wrote this kind of thing, I even spent more thought than a simple fight. Because it is actually explaining the logical relationship in the novel, and perfecting the character settings. For example, why do those cultivators all look so stupid? This paragraph is actually to explain similar problems. And in the previous chapters, it has also been mentioned many times and explained a lot of their psychology. For example, because they have fewer emotions, they see things very directly. Either they are ridiculously wrong, like the overconfident Yunzi, or they hit the nail on the head, like these sect masters and sect leaders who see through the fake sage. But if there are not many such explanations, then when reading many plots, it is possible to feel that the characters' reactions are illogical and logical flaws. This will actually greatly affect the reading experience. For example, a long time ago, someone said in the book review section to abandon the book. The reason was that there is obviously a problem with the mental cultivation of these cultivators. They have cultivated into monsters and should not cultivate like this. But if this friend has seriously read the book, he will realize that the problem he raised has long been explained in the novel, and more than once. There is indeed a problem with their cultivation. So if you did not read carefully, you will have to take the blame. The most obvious example is, if a protagonist like Li Yunxin were to be placed in other books, look at what stupid things he has done. He has killed himself time and time again. Knowing that it is dangerous, he still insists on sending himself to death, and in front of the enemy he is servile. These are all very scary points. But because I used so many different aspects to make everyone realize that he was actually an extraordinary person, and that he had his own logic and reasons for doing all these stupid things, it actually felt like, once you accept this setting, it's actually quite interesting, right? So, I hope that when you read my book, you do not need to read every word and sentence, but do not skip large sections. Because what you skip may be very important information in the future. If you skip this, you may have doubts in the future, such as, how can he react like this? How can he do such things? Chapter 496. When the two of them slammed into the door, everyone was in a daze. Xianxia was the first one to react. She didn't have time to argue with Su Yusong anymore. He wanted to run over and see what was going on. Grandma Bean used to be a Taoist priest in Yunshan. Her temperament was the most similar to a human among all the wandering souls. When she was in Yunshan, she taught Xianxia a lot of painting techniques. She was one of the few wandering souls that this little demon girl didn't hate. Now that she had lost Li Yunxin was a disciple of the art Taoism. She loved the house and its crow, so her impression of Dopa was even worse. He was worried. But she had only taken 2 steps when Lu Ling had already picked up Dopa, calling out repeatedly, "Granny, Granny. If you have something to say, say it quickly. She's here, she's here." Everyone knew that Lu Ling lost her supernatural power because of Li Yunxin's scheme. Later she got a body from Li Yunxin and became an ordinary person. Now she looked at her. She didn't have the elegance of a cultivator anymore. Instead she looked like an ordinary woman. Tears flowed out of her eyes as she shouted. She couldn't help but admire Grandma Bean's skill. In just a few days she had tamed this little girl. However, Dopa was being carried in her arms, being tossed around and rubbed. Originally she was a little angry and wanted to say something, but now how could she say anything? With his lips trembling, he reached out a hand to grab Lu Ling's shoulder tightly and stared at her. Seeing this, Su Yusong frowned. With just 1 step he appeared in front of the two of them. He didn't ask Lu Ling. He just put a finger on Grandma Bean's forehead. Then his face changed. Grandma Bean made a ho-ho sound again. She stared at Su Yusong. Lu Ling cried, "Grandma, Grandma, if you have something to say, say it quickly." But Grandmother Bean was already slowly losing her breath. She was like an ordinary old man with a serious illness in the secular world. She was about to die. Seeing this, Lu Ling cried to Su Yusong again. Grandma was hurt by a man who looked like a skeleton. He was very tall and came out of nowhere. After crying for a while, she shook the bean lady. "Granny, Granny. Grandpa Saint is here. Tell me." At this time Xianxia also came over. She grabbed Lu Ling's hair and pulled her aside. She scolded her sternly. "What are you screaming for? You shook a perfectly fine person to death." Lu Ling was now immortal. A cultivator of the transcendent state like Xianxia was like a god to her. There was no room for her to resist. She was immediately thrown to the side and her hair was undone, draping over her face. He didn't dare to come over and could only lie on the side and watch as Bean grandmother cried. After tearing Lu Ling apart, Xianxia bent down and touched Grandmother Bean's forehead. Then her face turned pale like Su Yusong's. But she was only stunned for a short while, and then she immediately turned and stared at Lu Ling. "What do you mean by a skeleton? Where is he? How did he get hurt?" It was not that she and Su Yusong did not want to save Grandmother Bean. But there was no way to save her. If a whole wandering soul was regarded as a mass of primordial qi, then Grandmother Bean's qi was now very weak. More than half of his soul had disappeared, as if it had been bitten and eaten by a monster. The wandering souls had never encountered such a situation. No wonder even Su Yusong was stunned. At this time Lu Ling could only cry. But at least she knew how to speak. I was sleeping and Popo was watching over me. When I woke up I saw Popo lying on the ground and that man walking away. Popo said that she had fought with him and knew that it was. At this point she paused, opened her mouth, tilted her head and fainted. Xianxia was so angry that she jumped up. From the moment she entered the door she had been shouting and crying instead of talking properly. Now she suddenly fainted at the crucial point. She was so hateful. She already had some resentment in her heart, but now it was all aroused by Lu Ling. She raised her eyebrows and was about to kill her with one palm, take out her soul, destroy her mind and interrogate her carefully. But when she was about to do it she heard someone say, "Stop." It was Zhou who spoke. After saying this he walked over in 2 steps. But he did not look at Grandmother Bean, but bent down and held Lu Ling in his arms. At that very moment, Xianxia's expression changed. She knew what Zhou expression and action meant. Zhou held Lu Ling in his arms, and the other hand gently stroked her cheek, brushing away the messy black hair on her face. Then he slowly untied her belt and lifted the lapel. Then he lifted the bottom 2 layers, revealing her undergarments. Then he took off her undergarments, revealing the girl's snow-white and delicate skin, and a burst of hot air mixed with her body fragrance. Then he saw a large bruise on her left chest. Above her left breast it was red and black. If an ordinary martial arts practitioner saw this injury he would definitely exclaim, "She was injured by a heavy method and there is no cure for it in the world." Zhou looked at the injury and covered her clothes again. He sighed softly, turned his face and said, "Alas. This child is also seriously injured." In the end she still managed to send Grandmother Bean back. Can be seen that she is a person who understands friendship. He turned his face but did not look at Xianxia. Instead he regarded Xianxia as heir and looked at Su Yusong. Xianxia's expression changed dramatically. Naturally she knew that Zhou was a man in the secular world who was tired of a woman would fall in love with a new person in the blink of an eye, so the new person was called a new lover. But now this wandering soul couple was tired of Xianxia, and their obsession was so strong that they suddenly fell in love with Lu Ling. What was it called? Li Yunqing was right. The person they doted on was not Xianxia. What they really doted on was the feeling of doting on someone and being doted on and loved by someone. That person could be anyone. Thinking of this, thinking of Li Yunqing and seeing Zhou holding Lu Ling in his arms, Xianxia felt sad. But in the end she just clenched her teeth, snorted and slowly retreated to the previous corner, hugged her legs and sat down. When Su Yusong saw Zhou's appearance his originally livid face slowly eased. After a moment of silence he looked down at Grandmother Bean. At this moment, Grandmother Bean's eyes were already lifeless. The whites of her eyes quickly became turbid and her face quickly aged. Soon she turned into a dried corpse. The whole process was unbelievably fast. It was also a situation that had never been seen before. Since he could not get anything out of her, Su Yusong's gaze fell on Lu Ling. Then he said, "Before, when this kid didn't know who we were, I liked her quite a lot." Pausing for a second he seemed to sigh in a low voice. "When she was in the Cloud Mountain, I summoned her and gave her many treasures. Back then the world was still ours. Back then the Cloud Mountain was prosperous." In the end he should have this sigh. Back then the Gate of Wonders was in their hands and the world was in their hands. All spirit creatures were hiding and dared not to make any trouble. Everything in Midland was in good order, and the hearts of Zhou and Zhou were full of hope, pride and confidence. But it was only a few months. The Gate of Wonders was broken and spirit creatures attacked to the foot of the Cloud Mountain. Many wandering souls died, and Zhou realized that many things weren't as easy as they looked. Although all of this was facilitated by the Freemasons in the dark and they couldn't blame anyone, seeing the beautiful thing that once belonged to them being destroyed really made them feel all sorts of emotions and they couldn't help but sigh. Hearing him, Zhuomuxia said, "So, good." Su Yusong sighed slightly. "So, she doesn't need to be immortal anymore. I'll keep her alive. When she wakes up, we'll ask her what happened. But in my opinion, it should be the spirit creatures over there. Spirit creatures are born with different abilities which can't be explained by magic. But I don't know which spirit creature has such a strange ability." A "so" and a "good." Everyone knew what it meant. It meant that they were going to turn this Lu Ling into a wandering soul. To refine, these two new darlings. No matter what the two saints thought, this meant that they had a new member. Therefore, the group of wandering souls in the hall also became happy. Earlier, when Lu Ling slammed into the door, their faces were full of coldness. But now they all gathered around Zhuomuxia, looking at the unconscious Lu Ling, clicking their tongues happily. But in the eyes of others, this scene was a bit scary. It was like a group of devils discussing how to share the flesh of a baby. Everyone was happy and no one paid attention to Xianxia anymore. Xianxia gritted her teeth and looked at them. She put her hand into her sleeve and took out a painting. It was the one that Li Yunxin had given to Lu Gongzan, drinking wine and pei di. And at this time the owner of this painting walked to a fork in the road. Li Yunxin had imagined the size of Cloud Mountain and the complexity of its internal passages. However, he didn't expect it to be so complicated and grand. He thought it should be similar to the stone road he took to Mount Shaoyin. It should be connected by many long tunnels that could accommodate several people walking side by side and several people high. There was either a wide hall or a stone chamber on either side of it. Many of these tunnels were intertwined, forming a complex and enormous nest that resembled an ant's nest. But now he knew. His guess about the structure of Cloud Mountain was correct. But his guess about the scale was wrong. For example, what he saw now. In fact, he should be in a big canyon. The bottom of the canyon was flat and it was hundreds of steps wide. It was hard to find a suitable analogy for this width in this world. But in his previous world, it should be said, it was the length of a standard football field. Length, not width. Such a wide canyon on both sides. There were rock walls of the same height extending upward and finally converging at the top. In fact, the cross-section was like a lying oval. At the bottom there were fallen weeds, slightly undulating terrain, clusters of bushes and woods. The stone walls on both sides were also covered with vines, trees and weeds. Some plants climbed all the way to the top. And they bore fruit. He didn't know whether the fruit was a natural mutation or the blessing of talismans, but it actually glowed. So the densely packed fruit hung on the top of his head, stretching from one end of his sight to the other, looking like a brilliant galaxy. Naturally, the canyon was lit up as if it was night. Li Yunxin knew that this was not a passage. It was more like a natural environment with a complete biological community. There were more similar huge passages extending in the Cloud Mountain. The entire Cloud Mountain was not filled with people, sects, or cold stone rooms as he had thought before. In fact, most of the space here was a natural landscape and people's residences only occupied a small part of it. No wonder cultivators didn't want to go to the Cloud Mountain. Except for the vast mountains and rivers, almost everything in the mortal world could be found on the Cloud Mountain. Such a huge thing could actually cruise in the air for tens of thousands of years in the Midland without disintegrating. Perhaps only divine beings could do that. However, this level of situation also caused his original plan to fall through. His original plan, for example, in a narrow passage. Although there weren't many people coming and going in the passage, at least there would be people passing by occasionally. He randomly grabbed someone on the road and used some random method to ask about the location of the Cloud Mountain, the cave residence, and the secret location. If he couldn't get one answer, he would ask a few more and finally he would arrive at his destination smoothly. But now he realized that this place was like a wilderness. He had been walking for nearly an hour, but he didn't see a single person. But he saw many wild animals and they weren't afraid of people at all. It was obvious that there weren't many people in this kind of place. It was really strange. The incomparably intelligent way River Dragon King Li Yunxin tried so hard to deceive all the powerful beings in the world, and then successfully sneaked behind the enemies, intending to take drastic measures. But he got lost. Who would believe this kind of plot? If a storyteller wrote something like this, he would probably be laughed at. The translucent jade slip should have been placed in the Cloud Mountain with the other treasures. The two wandering souls couldn't open it, so they definitely wouldn't carry it with them. But just like all the treasures he had handed over in the study, trying to use as signals, signposts, and guides at this time he couldn't sense them anymore. This meant that the special inhibition of the cloud mountain had also blocked the auras of those things. Now in front of him, to the left, the wild land in late autumn suddenly turned into the lush greenery in midsummer. The wide canyon on the left was filled with lush greenery. He didn't know where the light came from, but it was the same as the sunlight, like a summer afternoon. To the right there was a shallow stream. The shallow stream had white sand banks and beautiful and slender green grass grew on the banks. The two walls were covered with furry green moss, and occasionally there were small white flowers or water flowed along the stone walls. But the entire top of the canyon was slowly dripping water, as if it was a cloudy day and it was drizzling. Whether it was to the left or to the right, it would make people feel relaxed and happy in the secular world. But now in Li Yunxin's eyes he only felt that it was strange. Everything was too different from what he had imagined. It seemed that under the quiet and peaceful appearance, there was hidden danger. At this moment Li Yunxin heard a voice, someone calling him. He almost thought that his spirit was too heavily injured and he was hearing things. Hee. Is the king lost? Where did the king go? Chapter 497. The voice came from the left, on the other side of the white sand bank of the shallow stream where it was drizzling. The voice was shrill and thin as if it was a strange ghost speaking, but also like a cat. The voice was also very familiar. The first time he heard it, it said, "Where did you come from? How dare you behave atrociously in my palace?" If it wasn't an auditory hallucination, it was Sanhua's voice. At this moment, Li Yunxin suddenly pursed his lips, tensed his body and looked in the direction of the voice. It was impossible. Sanhua couldn't have appeared in such a place. Before Li Yunxin and Lu Gongzan were bombarded by the godly thunder of the ninth heaven, Sanhua, Shuk and Sky went to Baijingdu with Sanhua. At that time, Li Yunxin said that he wanted to establish a Little Demon Protection Association. Lu Gongzan was very interested, so he sent the three of them there to collect the little demons. Because at that time, Li Yunxin was a little suspicious of Sanhua. For example, in the alley of the city of Wei, when she possessed the dragon lady and attacked, it was obvious that she wasn't a wandering ghost. It seemed that she had a background. However, in the end he still looked like a lunatic. She also saved Li Yunxin's life, so he didn't think too much about it at that time. In this world, who didn't have a past and a secret? If you had to find out everyone's background before you could use them, then there was no need to do anything. Moreover, his suspicions were merely about her background, and he did not think of anything worse. But the three of them went to Baijingdu and then Mount Jun was attacked. In order to keep him, Lu Gongzan decisively gave up the three demons. In his heart, the three demons couldn't compare to Li Yunxin. After that, Shuk and Sky were killed, but Sanhua escaped and there had been no news of her since. But he heard her voice here, on Cloud Mountain. The absurdity in Li Yunxin's heart was far greater than any previous similar experience. In fact, he was more willing to believe that his soul was damaged. But the next moment he saw it. Although this is a shallow stream. But the shallowness of a stream was relative to a river. How shallow could a stream that was half the width of a football field be? On both sides he could clearly see water plants, white sand, pebbles, transparent shrimp and swimming fish. But the deeper they went, the deeper the water became. In front of him was the white beach and 15 steps away was the deep water. Thus, a ripple suddenly appeared in the deep water. Then a furry head popped out of the water and shook its head fiercely. For a moment, water splashed everywhere. It was the head of a cat. White head. There was a little yellow above his lips, 2 yellow spots on his forehead, and a little black on the tip of his nose. It had golden eyes and a white beard. It was a female cat with 3 flowers. Beads of water hung from his long beard, making him look handsome and majestic. Then the cat swam with its head held high and soon reached the shallow water. It jumped nimbly onto a rock sticking out of the water, arched its body and shook off the water on its body before sitting down. Its front paws were placed in front of its body, and it tilted its head to look at Li Yunxin. As soon as it opened its mouth, it spoke in human language. Where did the king go? Li Yunxin stared at her silently, watching her tail flapping around him unhurriedly. Seeing that he did not speak, Sanhua began to lick its paws. While licking, it used its front paws to wash its face and ears. It was very busy. It was a familiar tone and voice. If it was anywhere on the ground, Li Yunqin would be convinced that this was the Sanhua he knew. However, on Cloud Mountain he took 2 steps forward and stood still. He frowned slightly. Why are you here? Sanhua put down its paws and happily patted its tail. I was brought up. King, look at me, isn't my body beautiful? Li Yunqin took 2 more steps forward and looked at her. Shiny with a long and neat beard. What a beautiful, Sanhua. Then he said, who brought you up? Sanhua was very happy to be praised by him. Suddenly it rolled on the rock. With its belly facing the sky, it raised its little face and looked at Li Yunqin with yellow eyes. Qing Kongzi? Ba Mingzhenzi? Mingzhenzi. He brought me up. Li Yunqin was slightly stunned. He did not expect that she would say these 2 names. Qing Kongzi, the leader of the 9 Heavens Divine Thunder sect. When Li Yunqin was attacked on Cloud Mountain, the cultivators used Qing Kongzi's magic weapon. Later, when Li Yunqin escaped, he chased after him alone and was tortured and killed by Li Yunqin in the wild forest. Before that, he also went to Baijingdu. It was he who killed the 2 demons Shuk and Siji. Mingzhenzi was the leader of the Ling Shao sword sect. He was the one who took away Lu Gongzan and took away Li Yunqin's folding fan that day. Li Yunqin was a rare smart person in the world, and his thinking was also surprisingly open and bold. As the saying goes, a mental patient has a broad mind, so because of these 2 names, a deduction was made. Combined with these 2 names and the facts of that day, there seemed to be such a possibility. Qing Kongzi went to Baijingdu to kill 3 demons but only killed 2. Sanhua must have used some method to get into his body without being noticed. Then Qing Kongzi returned to Mount Jun and met Mingzhenzi again. At that time Mingzhenzi had the spirit map that Li Yunqin painted the scenery of the city of Wei. Or, when she had an idea she would say it. This was Li Yunqin's usual bold style. He frowned. You got into Qing Kongzi's body. Then you ran into Mingzhenzi's spirit map. After that, Mingzhenzi came to Cloud Mountain. You came out of the spirit map and stayed here? Sanhua was happy. Huh? Hey. Your Majesty said it well, well said. It seemed that he guessed right. But it wasn't all a guess. In fact, there were many clues before. Li Yunqin just put them together. The reason why he dared to guess that Sanhua got into Qing Kongzi's body without being noticed was that there was no way for Sanhua to get in touch with the Mingzhenzi she mentioned. It was also because Sanhua seemed to be very good at this and was not noticed. The first time Li Yunqin saw her was in the ruined Mrs. Sanhua temple. At that time he also met the Emptiness Realm swordsman of Kenzo. At that time Sanhua's demonic power was low, but she stayed in the temple in the forest for a long time. The Emptiness Realm swordsman was also nearby, but he did not notice her. After that, when Li Yunqin interacted with her, she would often discover that this little demon was playing around her when she wasn't paying attention, and it wasn't just once. At that time he thought, the cat demon is very dexterous. However, it was still difficult to explain this matter with just this one point. Qing Kongzi was a perfected master and a sect master. Sanhua was just an Emptiness Realm demon. There was almost no reasonable explanation for an Emptiness Realm demon to get into the body of a perfected master without noticing. Li Yunqin casually made up such a conjecture and Sanhua said, well said. In fact, it was more like, a random reason or excuse was enough. He said it and she agreed, so the matter was over and everyone was happy. There was no need to delve deeper into why Sanhua came here. He just had to accept the result. Was this the thoughts of this strange and shrill calico cat in front of him? If it was, then Li Yunqin realized that another possibility might also come true. It might not be a coincidence that he met Sanhua. Therefore he took a deep breath and thought of another matter. Earlier, when Lu Gongzan was in Yunshan, he had sent him a message about Jin Guangzi accepting a Taoist weapon and going to find Li Yunqin for revenge. At Juanshang, Lu Gongzan was taken away by Mingzhenzi. Later, in the Battle of Changji Town, he was taken away by Jin Guangzi before Mingzhenzi died. Jin Guangzi was seriously injured and returned to Yunshan, so he brought Lu Gongzan here as well. Originally, he thought he was a prisoner, but news came out. Li Yunqin was very surprised. But at that time he was in a dangerous situation and didn't think too much. When he received the news, it was in Mamwan Mountain before he met Ding Min and the others. At that time, it was a hunter in the mountain who called himself Mu Nanju who passed the message to him. Earlier when Li Yunxin met Lu Gongzan, he asked him about the situation when they walked to the place where the pheasant was kept. Lu Gongzan told Li Yunxin how he received the news and how he passed it on. He mentioned a detail in the conversation. At that time he didn't care. Now that he saw Sanhua, he realized that the detail was unusual. Lu Gongzan said that he was indeed on Yunshan Mountain at the time, in the Yunshan station of the Wuji sword sect. No one paid special attention to him anymore, so he had some freedom of movement. One night he suddenly heard someone talking on the other side of the wall. The tone and voice were similar to Sanhua's. Lu Gongzan knew that it was impossible for Sanhua to appear on Yunshan Mountain, so he realized that perhaps it was someone from Munanju. The people there knew a lot of things. If they imitated Sanhua's appearance, he would know what they meant. He tried to sound him out with a few casual questions. The Munanju man, whom he had never met before, only pretended to be one of the 3 flowers. He also casually told him some small details about their interactions with Li Yunxin. At this point, how could he not believe that it was indeed someone from Munanju who pretended to be in contact with him? Therefore, in this situation where both sides knew, Lu Gongzan told the person that Golden Light had obtained a Taoist instrument. He did not expect that the news would really spread. When Lu Gongzan mentioned this, Li Yunxin thought, "This is wonderful." He did not need to reveal his identity. He only pretended to be a Sanhua that Lu Gongzan was familiar with, and his disguise was flawless. On the one hand, he showed his strong ability to obtain information. On the other hand, he used the most barbaric and direct way to dispel Lu Laodao's doubts. If he knew all this, why would he need to test him if he was from Xianmen? But now that he saw the beautiful tricolor cat that was possessed by the tricolor flower, he realized, maybe that night was not someone from Munanju pretending to be Sanhua. Moreover, it was indeed hers. He narrowed his eyes and whispered, "Were you the one who talked to Lu Gongzan before?" The 3 flowers were still cute, eccentric, and mischievous at the same time. But if she did all these things or someone instructed her to do it, including saving Li Yunxin from danger for the first time, then he could no longer see her as just a little demon. Sanhua rolled over and stared at him without blinking. That's right." Li Yunxin was silent for a while. "Who told you to do it?" The cat monster blinked and tilted her head to look at him. Her pupils narrowed into 2 thin black lines. It's the second shopkeeper." The second shopkeeper. Of course, Li Yunxin did not know who the second shopkeeper was. But he knew which kind of people liked to use this kind of name, Munanju. What Sanhua meant was, back then it was the people from Munanju who asked her to ask Lu Gongzan. Then she got the news and spread the news. In fact, there were still many things that needed to be asked, if she wanted to ask. But now Li Yunxin seemed to be sure of one thing. It should not be a coincidence that Sanhua met him. At this time he seemed to have successfully hidden from the eyes of most people in the world. But there were still some people who were not fooled by him. These people might be allies, or they might be allies for the time being. But this feeling still made Li Yunxin frown. From the beginning to the end he had always hated the feeling that someone thought they could be superior to him, manipulating him. The 2 wandering souls of Cloud Mountain used to think so Li Yunxin spent a lot of effort to escape from their sight and tried to create some trouble for them. But now, no matter who knew he was still alive, they did not seem to have learned anything from what he did to Su Yusong and Zhuomuzhe. Li Yunxin was silent. Then he laughed. If Lu Gongzan saw him laughing, he would know that it meant that he was very angry. So much so that he laughed. "Okay." Li Yunxin smiled kindly and said, "Good cat. So, how did you find me now?" "Well, forget it. There is no point in asking this. What are you going to do now that you have found me?" Sanhua seemed to be unable to understand the meaning in Li Yunxin's smile. She stood up on the rock, arched her body and stretched. My king is lost." "Well, where are you going, my king?" "I want to go to Cloud Mountain," said Li Yunxin. He stopped asking questions and seemed to have accepted everything. "Do you know where it is?" Sanhua happily jumped off the rock and stepped on the water to get to the shore. She stretched her feet to shake off the white sand on the soles of her feet, ran to Li Yunxin's feet and rubbed against him. I know, my king. I will take you. Go. You are very familiar with Cloud Mountain." Sanhua began to run. She ran along the stream at a fast speed, leaving shallow, plum-shaped paw prints on the white sand. Li Yunxin followed closely behind, silently observing her and everything around him. He suddenly felt like he was still in the net. He had escaped from Su Yusong and Zhuamuji's net, but then he realized that they were actually in another, bigger net. He really hoped that it was an illusion. Because even a crazy person like him didn't really like the life and death struggle part of the plot. Chapter 498. About half an hour later, Li Yunxin and Sanhua passed another fork in the road. The road ahead had its ups and downs, but it looked like gentle slopes and hills on the plain. However, when they looked at the fork in the road ahead, they saw a passage going up. It was as wide as the canyon that Li Yunxin was in. There was a long stone staircase in the middle, about 6 or 7 people walking side by side. It was paved with white marble and went up along the slope-like passage. Li Yunxin couldn't see where it went. After all, the top was not the sky, but the stone roof of the canyon. However, the top of this road was nothing but clouds. The clouds rolled slightly, emitting a golden light that illuminated the passageway brilliantly. It looked like an immortal's home. This was the first man-made trace that Li Yunxin saw after walking around for so long. In fact, it was the mountain gate of a Daotong cultivation sect. This majestic passageway should be the path to the sect. It was just that the mountain road in the secular world was a staircase on the mountain, and there were always plants on both sides. However, the two sides of the white marble staircase on this road were still flat, long slopes, on which all kinds of strange flowers and plants were embossed. When Sanhua walked here, her footsteps gradually slowed down. Then she stopped at the entrance of the mountain gate, lowered her body, suddenly pressing down her ears, revealing 2 canine teeth, and fiercely hissed. Li Yunxin knew that this was the appearance of a cat when it was angry. After all, Sanhua was not a simple cat, but she also used this way to express her emotions. If she didn't do it on purpose, it seemed to mean that after Mrs. Sanhua possessed this cat, her temperament also merged with the animal nature in the cat's body. This was very interesting. However, he still didn't know what she was angry about, until she squinted her eyes again, turned her head to look at Li Yunxin and said in a soft voice, "Pai King, a Xianxia Danding sect." Li Yunxin's expression froze and he also stopped walking. The corner of his mouth was slightly pressed down. There were many people who had offended him. Some of them he could afford to offend, so they all ended badly. There were some people that he could not afford to offend, but he was a narrow-minded person who would never forget his hatred. He had always kept it in mind, waiting for the right moment to use it. However, there was one guy who was lucky. It was the sect master of Daotong's high-clarity pill cauldron sect, Gui Yuanzi. When he and Old Lu were having a heart-to-heart talk on Mount June, there were 3 main culprits. One was Qing Kongzi, the head disciple of the Nine Heavens Divine Thunder sect, who was torn to pieces by him in the wild forest. Ming Zhenzi, who had taken away Lu Gongzan, was also killed by him in the Battle of Changji Town. There was also the sect master of the Pill Cauldron sect, Gui Yuanzi. After failing to kill Li Yunxin, this guy and Ming Zhenzi went far away and never showed up again. But it was already marked in Li Yunxin's heart. He didn't know if he would be able to sleep peacefully during this period of time. The last time Li Yunxin heard of the name, Gui Yuanzi, was only recently. After Su Yusong imprisoned him in Mount Chuyun, he stayed in the profound sect's camp for a day, so he heard that this Gui Yuanzi was injured. Gui Yuanzi's lungs were injured when he fought with a great demon on the formation. This injury wasn't serious, but it wasn't light either. So Su Yusong told him to return to Cloud Mountain to recuperate. In reality, he wanted him to stay on Cloud Mountain to prevent any disasters. There were a total of 4 high-level cultivators who stayed on Cloud Mountain. 3 True Realm and 1 Profound Realm. Apart from Gui Yuanzi, the other 2 True Realm cultivators were seriously injured. It was said that they might not even be able to keep their corporeal bodies. The other Profound Realm cultivator, Li Yunxin, had never heard of him. But it was said that he was also seriously injured, so he didn't take it to heart at that time. But now it was such a coincidence. On the way to Cloud Mountain, he actually walked to the door of his enemy's house. Li Yunxin stood there and looked up the stairs for a while, then turned to look at Sanhua and asked heavily, "This is the Pill Cauldron sect's mountain gate. Are you familiar with it?" Sanhua's ears perked up. His long beard also perked forward. He seemed to be interested and excited. Familiar. Great King, you want to exterminate the entire sect? Exterminate the entire sect. This cat demon spoke in a soft voice, and as she spoke she let out a maniacal laugh. But her words were talking about exterminating the entire sect and the like. Those who didn't know what was going on would feel a chill run down their spine when they heard this. But Li Yunxin thought for a while, then shook his head. I'm not a devil. Gui Yuanzi is detestable, but those disciples under him have no enmity with me. If they don't cause trouble and are willing to stand at the side and watch me kill Gui Yuanzi, there's no need to exterminate his entire sect. The cat demon squinted her eyes and laughed. Hee hee, that's right. But not now. Li Yunxin took a step forward. Let's go to Cloud Mountain first. After the matter there is settled, I'll find this Gui Yuanzi and have a good talk. The cat demon blinked her eyes. Reluctantly, she looked towards the Pill Cauldron sect's mountain gate for a while before following Li Yunxin's footsteps. After another hour, Li Yunxin knew that they had arrived. The two demons passed by many different landforms along the way, but they didn't see any other sect's mountain gate. Now they were in a snowy mountain canyon surrounded by pure white snow. The stone walls on both sides that extended towards the sky were sealed by a layer of ice. There were no traces of life on the ground, only black rocks and snow. In front of them was the end, there was no more path. They faced a stone wall that was hundreds of meters tall and they couldn't see the top. This was also the height of the canyon. Sanhua stopped in front of the stone wall, pressed her ears down and used her front claws to dig the snow. After digging for a while she shook off the snow that had fallen on her ears, then shook her head. Great King Aya, we've arrived. Li Yunxin walked over and looked into the shallow hole that she had dug. He originally thought that it would be an entrance or something else, but in the end there was nothing but broken rocks. He frowned suspiciously. Sanhua squatted beside the hole, tilted her head and used her front claws to dig the stones. Finally she pulled out a thumb-sized, ordinary-looking stone. She raised her head and looked at Li Yunxin. We've arrived. Li Yunxin suddenly realized something. He stooped down and picked up the stone. Then he thought of Lord Dongting's Red Flower City. When that mysterious realm demon took Li Yunxin to Red Flower City for the first time, he found a very inconspicuous red flower on many flood dragon skeletons at the bottom of Dongting Lake. Inside the red flower was the vast dragon palace of Lord Dongting, a mysterious realm demon. Now as soon as he held the stone in his hand he immediately felt an indescribable emptiness. Although the stone was in his hand, the boundless space was unfolded in his mind. This sudden contrast made Li Yunxin's hand tremble slightly, and he almost dropped the stone on the ground. But only with the demon's permission could others enter Lord Dongting's Red Flower City. But the space inside the stone in his hand was open. It was not difficult to get in. The difficult part was to find it. Sanhua found it effortlessly, as if she was very familiar with everything on Cloud Mountain. She never explained anything, but she also never hid anything. Li Yunxin also wanted to find out about her, but he knew that now was not the time. He took a deep breath. Then, Sanhua raised her foot and scratched her ear. Your Majesty, go. Come back to the mountain. Kill them all. Li Yunxin knew that the mountain she said referred to the Pill Cauldron sect of the Xianxia sect. In fact, he could also see the greed in her eyes, like a cat that liked the smell of blood. But he didn't know what exactly this cat demon coveted in the Cloud Mountain of the Xianxia sect. Although he still had some doubts about this cat demon, he was not a timid person. He didn't have much time to begin with, and at this juncture, there was no need to hesitate. So he smiled. Okay. Then wait for me here. After saying this, his consciousness suddenly sank. The howling of the snow and the bone-piercing chill in his ears immediately disappeared. He appeared in a familiar place, the stone path. When Xianxia brought him here on the star shuttle for the first time, they also came out of the star shuttle through this stone path. At that time he thought that it was one of the countless paths leading to Little Cloud Mountain. But now he knew that it had always been this one path. He calmed his mind and walked at a moderate pace, sensing all the movements in this stone path. When he first entered Little Cloud Mountain he walked to a certain place and suddenly saw a glimmer of hope. He walked into Little Cloud Mountain. Looking back he could only see the stone wall but not the path he came from. This way of entering should be some kind of restriction or formation. Now Li Yunxin was faced with two possibilities. One was to walk in effortlessly just like the last time. The other was, after walking for half an hour he realized one thing. This stone path had no end. He walked on the stone path at a moderate speed for almost an hour. But there was still endless darkness in front of him, and there was no change in his surroundings. He knew that if he continued walking he would walk until the end of time, until someone who knew how to break this restriction released him. So he stopped and let out a light breath. The next moment his consciousness moved and his soul transformed into an avatar. He didn't know where this avatar would go. He just wanted to go as far as he could, hoping to appear in Little Cloud Mountain. But then with a grunt he spat out a mouthful of golden dragon blood. The avatar was destroyed as soon as it appeared. He didn't know if it ran into this restriction. Like Tang Wuxia, not even a speck of dust was left. So this path wasn't the entrance either. This path seemed to be just a symbolic path. Its direction didn't mean the direction of the entrance. But Li Yunxin just spat out the remaining blood in his mouth. Without any hesitation he created another avatar behind him. The next moment he spat out another mouthful of blood. The avatar was destroyed again. Any cultivator or demon who used their avatar as a pawn to explore the path couldn't afford it. If the avatar was damaged, their cultivation would also be greatly damaged. High-level cultivators and great fiendish demons often cultivated for hundreds or thousands of years. How long would it take to cultivate if one or two avatars were destroyed? But Li Yunxin didn't care. When he spat out the second mouthful of blood he created a third avatar. So before the second mouthful of blood could be spat out, a third mouthful rose up his throat. Just like that. When the ground had been corroded by his 10th mouthful of blood and was riddled with holes, Li Yunxin was also sitting against the stone wall, barely breathing. Chapter 499. At this time, looking at his face, he no longer looked handsome. It was as if his vitality had been sucked away by a beautiful female ghost. Not only did his cheeks collapse, but his skin sagged and even dark brown spots climbed up to his forehead. He looked like an old man at the end of his life. There were countless people who sought death in the world. But those who sought death like Li Yunxin could be said to be unparalleled in the world. However, he found it. His 19th incarnation appeared in the Little Cloud Mountain. The floating mountain where the two saints lived was in the middle of the vast space that was nearly 100 miles long and wide. Because of this distance, Li Yunxin's soul avatar not only appeared on Little Cloud Mountain, but also appeared on the floating mountains group of palaces. Note 2. At this time his incarnation also faithfully reflected the appearance of the original body. A lamp at the end of its life, like an evil ghost, as if it would fall apart if it took a few more steps. The place where he appeared was a square paved with white jade. Looking around he could see the undulating mountains in the northwest. It was verdant and beautiful with overhanging eaves. He knew that it was the place where he was once imprisoned, the palace complex where the art saint once lived. He was imprisoned there for a long time, and while looking at the scenery every day he slowly figured out the layout of the floating mountain. Now he wanted to go there, because there was one of his treasures. Before Zhou Xian took him out of Shaoyin Mountain he had already broken the restriction in the study of the art saint and slipped out while those little people were attacking Zhou Xian. But when he was about to reach the tree wall he seemed to be exhausted and finally fell to the ground, and was easily captured by the fake saint. In fact, it was fake that he was exhausted, and the real reason was to deceive people. It was just to distract the fake saint. At that time, at the place where he fell, he buried a scale deep in the soil. His incarnation swept over there like a gust of wind while his original body sat outside on the verge of death. He carefully sensed the chi activity between his original body and his incarnation, in case he accidentally went overboard and his incarnation would disperse again. About a quarter of an hour had passed. The haggard Li Yunxin's original body let out a long breath. Then he slowly raised his hand, closed his eyes and chopped at his own head. Logically speaking, a palm strike from a perfected dragon great demon would be able to smash even metals and rocks into smithereens, let alone brains. But right now he was like a dried-up oil lamp, his arm was powerless. Unexpectedly this palm strike did not kill him, it only caused his forehead to cave in, causing one of his eyeballs to burst out. This time how painful it was. He had died neatly before. Even if they died outside the cloud mountains they did not suffer for long. But now his palm didn't kill him. Instead it hurt so much that his limbs went soft. When he raised his second palm strike it was even more powerless. His mind became even more chaotic, but he was still not dead. On the other hand, demons had strong vitality. The weaker he was, the harder it was to kill him. He dragged on like this for almost an hour as if he was torturing himself, until a large part of his head had sunk in, but he still had a breath of life left. This terrifying experience. In her heart, Li Yunxin cursed all the cultivators and demons in and out of Cloud Mountain, from her ancestors to the birds and beasts that she had nothing to do with. This dragged on for another quarter of an hour. Inside the Cloud Mountains, the soul that had been sitting powerlessly on the ground for a long time holding a piece of scale armor suddenly shook, turned into a demonic wind and attached itself to it. In the next moment the transparent figure quickly took shape, colored and became clearer. Li Yunxin had once again taken over the body and returned to his original appearance. After his resurrection in the formation, his skin was delicate, and when he resurrected in the prison cell where Lu Gongzan was imprisoned, his skin was truly fragile. Now this was the third time he was already extremely weak and every movement he made felt weak. After appearing, he pushed himself on the ground to stand up. Who knew that when he pushed himself up, his palm was poked by a grass stalk, immediately poking a hole. But this hole was like an illusion. As soon as it appeared, it healed immediately. But even so, Li Yunxin knew that it was not good. When he smashed the sword cultivator's head and sword with his palm, it was the metal pieces that cut his palm. But now he was cut by a grass stalk. The continuous possession and loss of his avatars had caused the demonic power in his body to be completely exhausted, and it also made his physical body look extremely fragile. It was even worse than a mortal with coarse skin and thick flesh. Although he had expected this and thought of a way to deal with it before he sought death for the third time. But now he still felt that the world suddenly became dangerous. He had been cultivating since he was young. Although his realm was not as high as it was now, he was still a young genius and his physical body was far stronger than ordinary people. He did not care about any bumps and bumps. But now it was the first time in his life that he experienced the feeling of his physical body being fragile. Although it did not affect his physique, it was still unpleasant. This kind of unhappiness appeared when he resurrected this time, and it was also because of the various tortures that his original body had suffered before. Li Yunxin stood up and cursed. He cursed as he walked. When he walked to the shallow bay in front of the art saint's study, he rolled his eyes. Then he bent down and put his mouth to the water, drinking like a whale. When he drank his stomach full of water, he let out a long sigh of relief. In fact, he was not thirsty. But he drank it for other purposes. Now he was in Mount Shaoyan. For a long time, this space had only been inhabited by two false saints. It was the enemy's hinterland lair, but it was also the safest place now. It was like a bank vault. He had gone through a lot of hardships to get here. How could he return empty-handed after entering a treasure mountain? So he narrowed his eyes, stretched out his hand to block the blazing sunlight from the dome and walked southeast. According to Xin Shilio, that was the dome hall. It was the place where Su Yusong and Zhou Muzha carried out their daily activities, and there were other things that the two of them regarded as treasures. Now he was going there. The Art Saints group of halls was on a small hill to the west of the floating mountain. He slowly walked down the road on the hill. There were exotic flowers and plants on the side of the road, their fragrance assailing his nostrils. Tall trees rustled in the wind and there were bushes growing under the trees. Among the flowers and plants, there were occasionally fruits, but they were not ordinary flowers and fruits of the mortal world. In the past, Li Yunxin did not understand many cultivation classics, but he understood natural history. It must be known that Li Chunfeng and Shang Guanyu had conflicting thoughts. They wanted this child to stay away from disputes, but they could not bear to see him become a short-lived mortal. Thus he had only taught him a few scattered spells, but had never been taught systematically. However, there were some things that he did not mind knowing. It was these natural history and miscellaneous knowledge. But a considerable part of these natural history and miscellaneous knowledge were dragon-slaying skills for the former Li Yunxin. He did not have a paradise and naturally did not have the opportunity to see many rare treasures. But now there was a place for them to use. Finally, for the first time, he saw with his own eyes the appearance of many treasures whose names, habits, and effects he already knew. Therefore, he knew that the thumb-sized strings of bright red fruits here were called the 11 Silk Immortal Treasures. They contained extremely dense spiritual energy, but they were also highly poisonous. He could either plant them for fun, or use them to dilute the medicinal properties of pills. As Li Yunxin walked, he grabbed these bright red poisonous fruits in his hands, slapped them into his mouth, chewed until his mouth was full of red juice and swallowed them all. Ordinary fiendish demons might be afraid of the overbearing poisonous fruits. But dragons did not have bodies, they were all formed from dragon soul and demon power. No matter how poisonous they were, they could not poison Dragon's son. After eating these poisonous fruits, he saw a few tall and thin trees in front of him. They swayed in the warm wind, like a few thin and tall people lazily basking in the sun. This tree was called the Drunken Cloud Immortal Tree, and the fruit it bore was called the Drunken Cloud Fruit. Needless to say, the spiritual energy was also very dense, and it could be used to make bejeweled nectar wine, or eaten as a celestial quality fruit. But it was said that the Drunken Cloud Fruit had one drawback. It was the most sour in the world. To make celestial quality fruit to eat, it had to go through a complicated process of seasoning. Xianxia did not believe it. Seeing some light green chicken-sized fruits on the trees that were ripe, he plucked one and fiercely took a bite as he walked. As a result, he immediately grimaced and his saliva overflowed. This terrifying sourness caused his eyebrows to scrunch up. He threw the fruit away and then spat it all out. After spitting it out, he still felt sour, so sour that he was about to get angry, so he turned around and walked back. Previously, when he and Xianxia tested each other at the foot of the mountain, that demoness already had deep feelings for him. She told Xianxia many interesting things about Zhou Xian and Wuxia. For example, Zhou Xian's favorite bejeweled nectar wine was made from the Drunken Cloud Fruit. Moreover, only these 4 Drunken Cloud Immortal trees here were the best. Every 10 years of wine brewing depended on them. Now that Xianxia thought of this, he walked in front of the 4 trees that were as thick as the mouth of a bowl. As far as he knew, such thick Drunken Cloud Immortal trees should have been growing for thousands of years, and lifted his foot. Left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot, all of them broke on the ground. Breaking them was not enough to vent his anger. Then he jumped up and trampled on the ripe and unripe fruits. As he trampled, he scolded, "You shameless bastard, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour, who asked you to be sour." After venting his anger here, he continued on his way. Then he saw things like corrosive grass, green lotus fruit, jade skin red sand seed, flying cloud apricot delicate, and so on and so forth. It must be known that many of the fruits that contained spiritual power were not meant to be eaten, so the taste was bound to be terrible. At this moment, the spiritual power in Xianxia's snow mountain and ocean of qi, or rather demonic power, was almost exhausted. Whatever could replenish spiritual power, he stuffed it into his mouth, regardless of what it was originally used for. However, not only did he eat it, but he also threw a tantrum. If he felt that the taste was not bad, he just passed by. If he felt that the taste was terrible, he would become fierce, scold, jump, beat, and trample. How many of these poor immortal herbs, immortal trees, and immortal flowers tasted good? Therefore everywhere he passed was a mess. How many precious treasures were ruined by him? If Zhou Xian and Wuxia really saw this, they would be so angry that they would vomit blood. When this devil finally walked down the gentle slope and turned ahead, he saw an even larger garden. Note 1. The scale of Little Cloud Mountain is detailed in Chapter 340. They're afraid. It is a space of nearly 100 miles in length and width, and the floating mountain is in the middle of the space. Note 2. There is a problem here. I thought of it, but everyone may not think of it. It is fine not to add notes, but I am afraid that careful readers will think it is not rigorous. The problem is that Xianxia is in the stone path and he may not be close to the physical wall outside Little Cloud Mountain. In fact, he may be hundreds of miles away from the real Little Cloud Mountain. How can he be sure that his incarnation can appear in Little Cloud Mountain? The explanation for this problem is that the distance in the inhibition is not the actual distance. The reason why he knows this is that when he captured Snatch Fortune Quantum alive in Dongting Lake. At that time, Xianxia's incarnation was in Evil King's Pitfall Mountain, but his real body was in Dongting. The distance between the real body and the incarnation is far more than 30 miles, but the incarnation can still exist, because of the magic weapon Xianguang Mirror. Xianguang Mirror has the ability to cross space, so hundreds of miles in between are regarded as nothing. It is a bit abstract. But if the reader considers this problem, he should be able to understand. This sentence can be explained in the way of narration in the text. But too many such explanations will break the structure of the text. So I will not mention it in the text. Chapter 500. In order to know what this garden was for, one must first know what the palaces that once belonged to the art saint were for in the past. It was actually a livestock farm. Things like Xianmen treasures were like the painstaking work of mortal craftsmen. They couldn't be mass-produced, they were precious in quality. Thus, the materials used were all of the highest quality and couldn't be satisfied by the things in the mortal world. Many of the spiritual items used to craft treasures could only be found in Xianmen. And in Xianmen, the rarest of the rarest, could only be found on Little Cloud Mountain. In the past there weren't any palaces in the northwest of the floating mountain, it was just a forest. There were many treasures and many treasures. But after Qinhua established his sect and was recognized as the third saint, he came to Little Cloud Mountain and built his own residence in the only empty northwest area. Some of the less precious ones that were kept here, the ones that Li Yunxin destroyed as he walked, were left there and treated as a strange sight. And some of the truly precious ones that were crucial for Xianmen to craft treasures were kept in a garden. That was the garden that Li Yunxin saw at the bottom of the slope. The first thing he saw was a huge archway with 5 rooms and 6 pillars. It was an extremely gorgeous and exquisite thing, incomparably glorious and magnificent. Behind the archway was a wide path paved with spotless jade stones. On both sides were walls made of lush flowers and trees. Colorful butterflies danced in between. At the end of the path was a palace. Li Yunxin looked at the palace and frowned slightly. Although the palace was huge, it didn't seem to be big enough to contain many large beasts. On the battlefield he saw a huge golden-horned hoe under Guqin Jun. It was one of the rare beasts in the world and its body was full of treasures. That golden-horned giant centipede was almost the size of this palace, not to mention the others. But he knew that this was indeed a garden that hid many rare birds and beasts. Because he saw that on the horizontal board of this huge memorial arch, there were 3 big words written in a neat and orderly manner. Zhu. At this moment his craziness hadn't passed yet. For the past few months he had been struggling on the edge of life and death almost every day. It was already an unimaginable depression. Furthermore, in order to resurrect himself and enter this Little Cloud Mountain, he had suffered a great deal of pain. That kind of pain could drive a normal person crazy, let alone him who wasn't a normal person to begin with. Therefore, now that he was suddenly out of danger, all the pent-up frustrations in his heart burst out. He had been able to endure more than an ordinary person before, but now he was even more crazy than an ordinary person. Now that he saw these 3 words, he suddenly felt excited. He casually threw away the half-eaten fruit in his hand and walked to the huge memorial arch. He stretched out a finger and tested it on the stone pillar. On his way down from the art saint's study, he had destroyed more than a few hundred natural treasures and eaten countless more. Regardless of whether those things tasted good or not, or whether they were poisonous or not, they all contained an astonishing amount of spiritual power. Although he was a perfected master and the amount of spiritual energy and demonic energy he needed was unimaginable, it was enough to build a foundation for his stomach. Now that he exerted his strength, his fingernails grew sharp. It was pale gold like a small knife. He left a mark on the stone pillar with a slash. He smiled, raised his hand and carved 7 big words in a flamboyant manner. Li Yunxin was here. Then he thought for a moment and walked a few steps away. On the other side of the pillar he carved another 8 small words. It's not right to write words everywhere. Then he laughed wildly, lifted the hem of his clothes and strode along the path paved with white jade. He did not encounter any obstacles along the way. Because if he was Su Yusong or Zhuomuxia, there was no need to set up anything here. The entire space of the Cloud Mountain was filled with invisible restrictions. When cultivators and demons came here, they became ordinary people with strong bodies. But even with their powerful physical bodies, there was no way for them to leap thousands of meters from the ground and jump to this Little Cloud Mountain. Such a natural obstacle almost eliminated all possibilities. Only the descendants of the painting Dao could sneak up from the path at the bottom of the mountain. However, the problem was that Li Yunxin, who had the highest cultivation of the painting Dao in the world and was the most troublesome, was already dead. Needless to say, it was difficult to enter Little Cloud Mountain and even more difficult to enter Cloud Mountain. Moreover, they had also set up other methods here. However, Li Yunxin could not meet them now. He walked all the way to the front of the hall, up the 33 steps and into the front corridor. He raised his leg and kicked the door open. Then he saw an empty hall. It looked like it was sealed and not used. It was indeed built magnificently with tables and chairs, carpets, flowers and trees. However, no matter how he looked, it was just a main hall for receiving guests. It was not a zoo, or a place to raise rare birds and beasts. However, Li Yunxin was not in a hurry. Since he saw the words, zoo on the signboard, he knew who had set up this place in the past. If there was really a garden behind the signboard, he would be surprised. So he chuckled a few times and jumped in, starting to search anxiously. Naturally, it was like a bandit entering the house. Wherever he saw could be hidden, he kicked it over. If he couldn't find it, he would be treated like the flowers and trees before. All of them would be trampled into pieces. Since he couldn't take it away, he wouldn't leave it behind. The decorations and vases in the hall were all rare treasures. Even gold, silver, and jade would be considered vulgar and dirty here. They were only worthy of being used to pave the floor like the outside. However, all of these things were picked up by Li Yunxin to look at. If he couldn't see it, he would fall to the ground and die a horrible death. So he first destroyed the decorations in the hall, then flipped the tables and chairs. All the carpets were torn into pieces. In the end, only the paintings and sculptures on the wall were spared. So he started to look at them one by one with his hands behind his back. They were all good stuff, but he had destroyed them all. So until the 11th painting on the west side of the hall. Only then did Li Yunxin let out a huh. At first he thought it was a painting of words from afar. Of course it looked like words. It was framed and had a white background. There were some black characters on it. They seemed to be written in tadpole characters. But now that he looked closer, he realized, it was clearly a painting. The painting was a banner. The title on the right had a few words written vertically. The words written at the front of the painting were called title. Remember to visit the zoo on a sunny morning. After this line of words was the painting. With one look, Li Yunxin knew that it must be Qin Zhao's work. There was an oval with 4 small sticks at the bottom. There was also a small stick at the top with a small circle on the stick. 2 more eyes, 2 ears, a triangular horn and a tail were added to the small round head. There were 4 words written on it. Golden horn giant centipede. The other rare birds and beasts had similar techniques. The round body and stick legs were not very different. As if to distinguish them from each other, they were all marked. Flipping feather, flying feather, Philian, riverside, Huidou. All kinds of ferocious beasts, strange beasts, and auspicious beasts that Li Yunxin had heard of were all marked on the scroll. A rare beast was only the size of half a palm. This painting was more than 2 meters long. There were at least a few hundred of them lined up from the beginning to the end of the line. But even so, there was still a long line. So, there were many wavy patterns that went from thick to thin on the painting. It meant, there are many more in the distance, but I can't see them clearly. They're all illusions. But this wasn't what Li Yunxin understood. It was indeed a note written in the gaps of the wavy patterns. After this comment, there were even smaller, densely packed words that looked like smoke. They were all the names of rare birds and beasts. At a rough glance, there were at least a few thousand. Actually, it looked like it. He had thought that he could draw on such a large piece of paper. But the more he drew, the worse he felt. He could only use this method to make up for the number. Finally, there was a line of words at the end of the painting. It was a postscript. What a meaningful day. Li Yunxin stared at it for a while and frowned. Actually, this painting was slightly different from Qin Zhao's previous paintings. In her previous paintings, no matter how childish her strokes were, it was obvious that she had put her heart into them. For example, a child who had just learned how to draw would draw a chicken pecking rice. Even if it wasn't good, she wouldn't forget to point out the rice grains on the ground one by one. Some were serious and meticulous, but they didn't use dots. Instead, he was seriously drawing small circles one after another. But this painting, looking at the row of beasts at the front, it was obvious that she was also serious. But after reaching it, she seemed to realize that there wasn't enough space, so she scribbled. Then she saw the wavy lines, which meant that she was too lazy to draw anymore. Instead, she was thinking of a way to finish it. This meant that Chen Ying wasn't drawing this because she was interested. Instead, it was something that she had to finish. It was meant to be used. Thinking of this, Li Yunxin understood in her heart. He slowly put his hand on it and tried to feel the flow of spiritual power. Then he realized, it was exactly as he thought. This painting was similar to the other Octave Treasures scrolls. There was an astonishingly vast world inside. If he used enough spiritual power and found the right method, he could enter the painting. He had no doubt that every rare bird and beast whose name was written on the painting was in that world. There was indeed a zoo in the palace. It was this painting. But right now he didn't want to try. After all, his demonic power hadn't recovered yet. Plus, Qining was weird. He didn't know what tricks she had set up in the world in the painting that were interesting to her but dangerous to others. Finally, he didn't have any headaches. He didn't want to be stupid and put himself in danger again. But no matter what, he had to take this thing away. Many of the beasts in the painting should be grateful to Qining. If they weren't in the painting and Li Yunxin hadn't recovered his demonic power, he could take this thing for himself. He had planned to kill them all. The spiritual power in the immortal herbs and fruits was indeed dense. But no matter how dense those dead things were, they couldn't compare to these living things. If this really was a garden, and he had barged in, those that looked annoying would definitely be the first to be killed and eaten. Those that looked pleasant might also be eaten into his stomach happily, never to be separated. Those that didn't look annoying or pleasant. If that was the case, what was the point of living? Just kill and eat them too. But now they had escaped the calamity. Li Yunxin reached out and took the painting off the wall, rolling it into a scroll. He tore a piece of cloth from somewhere and tied it to his back. Then he went straight to the dome hall. Xianxia had said that many of Su Yusong and Zhou Mujia's treasures were in that hall. The dome hall wasn't far from here. On the way, he passed by a few small halls, but Li Yunxin didn't pay attention to them. He only moved up and down on the top of the hall like a martial arts expert in the mortal world. He was extremely happy. After a little more than a minute, he saw the square in front of the dome hall. However, this place was no longer as empty as the other places. There was a guard on the square. This meant that Xianxia was right. There was indeed something extremely precious to the two fake saints here. As a result, they called the reincarnation of the former master of calligraphy to guard it. On the incomparably wide square was Zhou Xian. Li Yunxin stood on the top of the hall nearly 100 steps away from him and saw him standing alone in the square. The ground of the square was white, and Zhou Xian's clothes were blue. He wore tight clothes and short clothes. He stood as straight as a javelin and there was no expression on his face. His eyes were wide open and his eyeballs kept looking left and right, observing the surrounding situation. The scene looked strange and terrifying. Li Yunxin knew at a glance that this reincarnation was now being controlled by Su Yusong and Zhou Muzhia. Previously, at the foot of the mountain when Su Xing was still hiding in his sleeve, he had mentioned this matter. For example, he knew that the first step to refining a person into a wandering soul was to completely destroy their clear consciousness. Then the person's head would be empty and he would become a puppet. He would do whatever his master said. But after all, it was only his clear consciousness being erased and his brain wasn't damaged. Therefore, not only was this puppet obedient, but it could also adapt to the situation. It was much more brilliant than the ordinary strong men and gods created by magic. If this puppet was refined with a secret method and injected with spiritual intelligence, it could become a wandering soul. However, in that way it wouldn't be as useful as the previous stage of the puppet. The fake saint wanted to refine this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher into a wandering soul. But the battle at the foot of the mountain took a turn for the worse, and he only had time to completely erase his consciousness. Now he asked this puppet to guard in front of the hall just in case. Finally, he could guard against Li Yunxin's what if. This reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had a strong physical body. Although he didn't have supernatural powers, he could use the supernatural powers of others. He might not be able to fully use them here, but there were many restrictions on Shaoyin Mountain that were still slightly effective. If this reincarnation of the calligrapher used those restrictions and formations, with Li Yunxin's current cultivation, if they really fought, it would be a tough battle where both sides would suffer and even a crushing defeat. Therefore he thought about it and sat down on the roof of another hall in front of the square. He narrowed his eyes and observed Su Xing from afar with a pensive look on his face. Chapter 501. At this time it was afternoon on Little Cloud Mountain. The sun was bright and the temperature was pleasant. The leaves rustled in the warm wind, which was filled with the fragrance of flowers, and there was the clear chirping of birds. Apart from that, the surroundings were very quiet, which reminded Li Yunxin of the previous world. It was also in the afternoon of a scorching summer. There was no one on the street, only the rustling of the leaves of an old tree on the street. The old dog was lying in the shade of the old tree, and the old man was sleeping on a rattan chair. It was as if the whole world had calmed down. He sat on the yellow glazed roof and the tiles around him were warm from the sun. Zhou Xian stood alone in the bright white square like a lonely tree. Li Yunxin stared at him for a while and realized that this guy was now guarding a certain area. If he didn't enter that area, the puppet would be fine. So he stretched out his hand and broke off a corner of the tile. Then he narrowed his eyes, glanced at it and threw it over. There was a great distance between the two. But the physical strength of cultivators and demons also meant that their reaction and control abilities were extremely strong. Thus, this palm-sized corner smashed into Zhou Xian's head, producing a distant, muffled thud. The tile shattered and a white mark was left on Zhou Xian's forehead. So he suddenly came alive. He suddenly raised his eyes and looked in Li Yunxin's direction, his face filled with violence and confusion. He seemed to have no idea why he was beaten. He looked like a ferocious beast at this time. But he only came alive for a moment. The next moment he slowly lowered his head and stood like a tree again. Li Yunxin thought for a while, then raised his voice and said, "Hey little brother. Come out to play." Zhou Xian heard his words. He raised his head slightly again. He looked at the direction of the voice for a while, then slowly lowered his head. So Li Yunxin let out a light breath and smiled again, "Then I'll go in and play with you." After saying this, he jumped down from the roof. Since he had no magical power, he couldn't float. His entire body landed on the ground with a thump. The white jade under his feet immediately cracked open like a spider's web. The cracks spread densely in all directions, causing a wave of dust to ripple. Thus, at this moment, Zhou Xian suddenly raised his head and puffed out his chest like a puppet. The joints of his four limbs let out a series of violent cracking sounds, and even a white mist rose from his body. Then the puppet created by the saint's tribulation body suddenly frowned and shouted, "What kind of monster are you? How dare you barge into the dome hall?" This terrifying puppet seemed to still be able to use the remaining restrictions on Little Cloud Mountain. As he shouted, ripples appeared in the air in front of him. It was obvious that this was not the power of his physical body. As soon as he finished speaking, the ground beneath his feet cracked and caved in. In the next moment he leaped over 60 feet with a single step, and his entire body was wrapped in blazing lightning as he pounced towards where Li Yunxin was standing. In the face of such terrifying momentum and power, Li Yunxin did not retreat even half a step. The distance between the two of them was only 60 feet, and Zhou Xian could reach him in 3 steps. However, when Zhou Xian took the first step, he restrained his expression and said in a deep voice, "King." Zhou Xian heard this voice, but he turned a deaf ear to it. When his second step landed on the ground, there was an even more terrifying shattering sound, dust and the sound of the wind. Even when he could already feel the strong wind blowing against his face, Li Yunxin still did not retreat half a step. He stared calmly and coldly at Zhou Xian, who was approaching him like lightning, and said 2 more words, "Sea lion." The puppet leaped up a second time and landed a second time, finally arriving in front of Li Yunxin. The terrifying lightning on his body instantly ignited a few strands of long hair hanging in front of Li Yunxin's forehead. He used his fingers as a knife, and a brilliant golden light appeared on his fingertips. It was like a light all that pierced straight towards Li Yunxin's face. At this moment, Li Yunxin said the last 2 words, "Scepter." Then he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. There was a crisp sound. The ruthless puppet suddenly widened its eyes and saw Li Yunxin's appearance in front of it. In the next moment, the lightning around its body suddenly retracted, and the golden light on its fingertips also dissipated. It shouted loudly, "Get out of the way." Its right foot stomped on the ground and it changed its direction in midair. Its palm blasted the ground beside Li Yunxin. Then there was a terrifying rumbling sound. The floor tiles on the white jade paved ground surged up like turbulent waves, shooting straight into the sky. The huge force did not decrease. It first blasted the floor tiles behind Li Yunxin, and then it continued forward, straight to the front hall where Li Yunxin had been standing before. The tall and majestic front hall was like a piece of paper in front of this force. It only took a moment for it to collapse. Countless pieces of earth and stone tore through the air like a storm and shot forward with a buzzing sound. Just like that, in the blink of an eye, The power of a single strike had destroyed 3 great halls in succession. Behind Li Yunxin, a terrifyingly wide and terrifyingly long stretch of ruins was blasted out. And this was the result of Zhou Xian forcefully dispersing his supernatural power and holding back his strength at the last moment. Now he was lying on the ground in a slightly embarrassed state and his hair was in a mess. But he was no longer in a daze. Before the huge roar dissipated, he suddenly jumped up from the ground and shouted at Li Yunxin, "Why didn't you dodge? If this palm hit you, your body and soul would have been destroyed." Li Yunxin laughed. Then he raised his hand to extinguish the fire that had just ignited in his hair, because it was exciting. Then he lifted his foot and walked into the dome hall. Zhou Xian gritted his teeth. Exciting? But after saying this word he didn't know what else to say. Slightly stunned, he hurriedly followed Li Yunxin's footsteps, looking like he had a lot to say. "What kind of curse did you just say?" After saying this he immediately said, "You threw a tile at me? You even made fun of me at that time." Li Yunxin snorted as he walked. "Curse? Even if it's a curse, I reconstructed 11 personalities for you before. There must be a few awakening commands. It's the curse you mentioned. But how the 2 wandering souls erased the consciousness of a person and what state it would be after erasing is all what you said to me before. Your face just now was scarier than a dead person's. I had to test whether your original consciousness was still there or not. Once something went wrong with what you said to me, I jumped in and couldn't wake up the next layer of your consciousness. Then it's not a problem of excitement anymore. So I smashed you first, teased you and observed." He said these words in one breath. In fact, he walked fast but spoke slowly. When he said this, he reached the door of the dome hall. Again he raised his foot and kicked the door down. Then he stood in front of the door and looked inside. The hall was huge, almost like a stadium in his time. There was not a single pillar in the terrifyingly vast space. The ground was black and the ceiling was filled with countless bright lights like a bright starry sky. On the other side of the door was an entire wall. There was nothing else on the wall, just a dense number of cabinets from the east to the west of the hall, from the ground to the dome. Perhaps this was the origin of the name Dome Hall. After looking for a while, Li Yunxin suddenly laughed coldly and his laughter made people's hair stand on end. "Oh, this is the place where the 2 bastards hid and schemed against people." But Zhou Xian only asked the person beside him, 11? What 11? Didn't you tell me there were only 8? Li Yunxin didn't turn his head and seemed to be perfunctory, just to be safe. Then he stepped into the door and walked to the wall of cabinets that occupied an entire wall. Zhou Xian, on the other hand, was asking about his personality. When he first saw Li Yunxin he was decadent like a useless person. So, Li Yunxin reconstructed a consciousness for him, but soon that consciousness fell again. So, Li Yunxin reconstructed a 3rd consciousness for him. When Li Yunxin arrived at the foot of the floating mountain and stayed for a few days with Exin Shiliu, Zhou Xian told him a plan. He knew that once the 2 wandering souls caught him, they would not kill him but refine him. When Zhou Xian was still the master of calligraphy, his body was taken away. Before escaping from Cloud Mountain by chance, he once learned how they refined wandering souls. The first step was to destroy the person's consciousness. At that time he felt that it would be extremely difficult for this body to survive. Instead of that, it was better to give up this body and boldly test it, to ask Li Yunxin to build a few more layers of consciousness for him. Then he pretended to be captured and asked the 2 wandering souls to destroy his consciousness. If what Li Yunxin built didn't work, then it wouldn't hurt to give this crippled body to the Freemasonry. If it had worked, it would have led to the current situation where they were working together from the inside and outside. Thus, in the previous situation, the wandering souls had indeed destroyed Zhou Xian's consciousness. However, the so-called consciousness was only the surface of the 11 layers of consciousness that Li Yunxin built for him. If this layer was destroyed, there was still the 10th layer. If the 10th layer was destroyed, there was still the 9th layer. This method did not belong to any kind of magical power in this world. It specialized in the level of consciousness. Even in Li Yunxin's previous world, it was an unimaginable and unbelievable method. How could he guard against the 2 wandering souls? So as long as Li Yunxin gave him a few awakening instructions in advance, Zhou Xian's 10th layer of consciousness immediately restarted and regained his consciousness. But at that time Zhou Xian felt that this body had no hope of surviving the tribulation. Who would have thought that after that, because of Li Yunxin's words in Chen Zhao's study, The last tribulation was completed and he was about to transform and leave. Luckily Su Yusong stopped him so the plan didn't fail. Now Su Xing was complaining that Li Yunxin had done something to his mind behind his back and built a few more layers of consciousness. But complaining was just complaining, he didn't take it to heart. Because this body's tribulation was complete, he could transform and leave at any time. Because of this, Su Xing still had the mind to linger here and not leave. He kept following behind Li Yunxin, planning to see why he came to the dome hall. Because, what are you doing here? After complaining for a while, he tidied up his messy hair and said behind Li Yunxin, "There's only human skin here. There's nothing you want." The two wandering souls had taken over the bodies of the two saints. For the first many years he wore the skin of a saint and wore it happily. But as time went on they got tired of it. Luckily the two wandering souls lived on Little Cloud Mountain. No one usually came. They didn't have their own missions like the other wandering souls. They had to faithfully play their roles at all times. Thus he was in a leisurely mood to change into some other clothes. Other people's clothes were fabric or leather. Their clothes, however, were the skin of a human. For example, when two people slept together at night, they didn't want old skin. It was wrinkled and shriveled and didn't feel good. They needed skin and flesh that was tender, well-proportioned and youthful and beautiful. It was only comfortable to hug, touch and kiss. But after choosing handsome men and beautiful women up Little Cloud Mountain, killing them, skinning them and wearing them all, they felt that they were too beautiful and tired of looking at them. So they wanted to look ignorant and young. So they chose 15 or 16 years old and had delicate features to wear. And so on. They liked to wear the appearance of a Taotai when eating. They liked to wear the appearance of a tyrant when giving advice. They liked to wear the feather fan and silk scarf when drinking tea. How many years had the two wandering souls been trapped in Little Cloud Mountain, and how many emotions and ways had they played with each other? In the end, the fruits of evil fell on the mortals of Little Cloud Mountain. When those poor mortals were chosen, they only said that it was a great blessing and that they were going to serve the two saints and obtain immortality. After 1,000 years, the north wall of this huge palace was filled with cabinets. Those cabinets were innumerable at once. They were densely arranged on the wall as if there were as many stars in the sky. Inside each compartment was a skin which used to be a living life. When Su Xing asked Li Yunxin what he was doing here, Li Yunxin had already walked to the bed. This bed was the place where the two fake saints usually changed clothes and chatted. It was unusually spacious, simple and comfortable. Li Yunxin stood in front of the bed and was silent for a while. Then he sneered, "Nothing I want? If the treasure I want the most is here. Let me ask you first. You said that your body is also on the floating mountain. Is it here?" Su Xing was startled. "Not here. It's somewhere else. What treasure?" Li Yunxin chuckled. "It's the treasure I want. 3 words, I'm happy." As he said this, he lifted the hem of his shirt and untied his belt. Su Xing was startled at first, then he widened his eyes, thinking that he had seen wrongly. "Huh? What are you doing?" Li Yunxin reached out and pushed him behind him. Su Xing heard the sound of water. The reincarnation of the former saint was stunned. No matter how crazy he was, he would never have thought that Li Yunxin was doing this. Li Yunxin was doing something that was extremely strange to the cultivators above the transcendent state, especially to him, and he had even forgotten the existence of this kind of behavior. He was peeing on the bed that the two fake saints usually sat on. Su Xing was dumbfounded. Li Yunxin was not embarrassed at all. After he was resurrected in the courtyard of the art saint's study, he immediately went to the bay and drank a bellyful of water. Not because he was thirsty but because he wanted to do this. He soaked the bed evenly as if there was no one else around. Then he tied the belt again, turned around and looked at Su Xing, who was stunned, and said expressionlessly, "What is this called?" "It's called moving clouds and bringing rain. If the two bastards come back alive, I'll let them enjoy the grace of the Dragon King." Then he leaped over the bed and stood in front of the towering wall of cabinets. He looked up and took a deep breath. He turned his wrist and untied the memories of a sunny morning visit to the zoo painting that he was carrying on his back. He slowly unrolled the painting, squinted his eyes, and found a name in the words that looked like a black cloud. Then he channeled his chi and used 2 fingers to reach into the painting and pulled. An earth-shattering cry of a baby reverberated in the spacious hall. What he pulled out of the painting was none other than a baby roe deer. This strange beast had a chubby baby face, but its body was that of a small roe deer. It was also a ferocious beast. He loved to harm people, but for no other reason than to eat people's skins. It often hid in the mountains in the middle of the night when it was quiet. When someone passed by, it would cry like a baby. Once a kind-hearted person heard the cry, it would immediately bite the person to death, and then slowly gnaw off the skin, leaving only a bloody body. Now that it was pulled out of the painting by Li Yunxin, it opened its mouth and was about to bite him. Li Yunxin immediately raised his hand and gave it 2 slaps. Only then did the ferocious beast realize its power. It did not bite him, but stared at the towering wall of cabinets with its eyes wide open. He laughed coldly and said, "Go eat." After saying that, he threw the roe deer baby against the wall. The ferocious beast immediately disappeared into the wall, and only a series of growling sounds could be heard from the bottom to the top. It passed through the wall unimpeded and began to eat heartily. Chapter 502. Zhou Xian was even more puzzled when he saw what he did. He wanted to walk to Li Yunxin's side. But when he took a step forward, he thought of what Li Yunxin had done on the bed, so he quickly stepped back and frowned. "What are you doing?" Li Yunxin laughed strangely. "What am I doing? I'm happy to make those 2 bastards unhappy." He laughed while listening to the sound of the roe deer eating human skin, as if he was enjoying some heavenly music. Zhou Xian sighed and shook his head. "Alas. You're being childish. These things are, after all, worldly possessions." Li Yunxin laughed coldly and interrupted his words. She looked at him from the corner of her eyes. "Worldly possessions? Humph, you cultivators practice evil techniques and don't look like humans, so of course you don't think it's a big deal. But those 2 wandering souls are much more like humans than you." After saying this, he walked back and forth in front of the cabinet proudly. If he had a tail, it would probably be sticking up. They have their own obsession, so their 7 emotions and 6 desires are very heavy. Human skin can be easily peeled off, so it's not a big deal. But these 2 bastards have been collecting these things for 1,000 years, and they're not tired of it. Instead, they put them in this hall. "Tell me, are these things worldly possessions to them?" He said while gritting his teeth. "I said a few bad things about them in front of X and Shilio, so those 2 bastards held a grudge against me. They wanted to keep me alive, but in the end they wanted to kill me." "Hey, hold a grudge. Is there anyone in the world who holds a grudge better than me? Destroying their skin today is just an appetizer. In the future, if they are lucky enough to survive this time, it will be the beginning of the show. As if, kill me. How painful it feels to beat your own eyeballs out." He sneered while pacing back and forth, muttering and gnashing his teeth as he said these words. This made Zhou Xian's heart tremble. He looked at Li Yunxin. No matter how he looked at her, she looked like a lunatic. But she was still conscious. It was really strange. But after hearing his words, she couldn't help but say, didn't you plan to kill you from the start? Didn't you say that if those 2 wanted to keep you alive, they would find a way to make them hate you so much that they would kill you in front of the formation so that they could escape?" Li Yunxin stopped and turned around to glare at him. He said confidently, "So what if I am? I asked him to kill them and he actually killed them. What's wrong with me bearing a grudge against him?" Zhou Xian let out another sigh. Crazy. This Li Yunxin was probably really crazy. Perhaps his spirit had been damaged by the possession over and over again. But he wasn't sure. He had only heard Li Yunxin mention this method, but he didn't know the inside story. But no matter what, Zhou Xian shook his head. "Fine. In the end, I won't be able to stay here for long, so I'm leaving just like that. If you want to go crazy and wreak havoc on Cloud Mountain, I'll accompany you." After saying this, he said sternly, "But you did this to vent your anger. But didn't your previous efforts go to waste? You originally planned to let everyone think that you were dead. Now that you sneaked back and saved someone, you still have a way to cover it up. But to make such a ruckus, those 2 wandering souls will know that it was your doing." Li Yunxin turned around and looked at him disappointedly. "Friend, are you stupid? If you ran to someone's house and melted their talisman, would you leave a note saying that it was done by me?" When Zhou Xian interacted with Li Yunxin previously, he felt that although he was strange and crazy, he was still polite and restrained. But now that Li Yunxin was released from the layers of pressure, he immediately changed. When he talked to him again, even if it was this sage's reincarnation, he was like a gangster in the market, no respect at all. But Zhou Xian didn't want to argue with this madman. Although he didn't know if the talisman Li Yun mentioned was a Daotong talisman or a Kenzo talisman, he still sighed. Of course I don't. Li Yunxin suddenly laughed. I do. After saying this, he casually pulled down a cabinet door. The cabinet was empty, the skin had been eaten by the roe deer baby. Then he stretched out his finger and carved a few words on the cupboard that was taller than a person. Li Yunxin destroyed the bastard's human skin here. After thinking for a while, he carved a small line next to the words. Look at the back, there's a surprise. As he carved, he couldn't help but laugh. This made Zhou Xian's heart pound. He was a demon after all, a demon. Then he saw Li Yunxin flip the door over and carve. I told you to look, so look. Stupid. After carving this, he couldn't help but laugh. Zhou Xian sighed again. Just as he was about to tell him that it was useless, he suddenly realized Li Yunxin's carvings were a bit strange. As soon as he thought of this, he immediately let out a soft, huh. After taking a closer look, he cried out, You're imitating Qin Zhao's handwriting. Qin Zhao's drawing skills were bad, but his handwriting was passable. After all, he had lived for a long time. With some practice, he wouldn't be too bad. And Li Yunxin's talent didn't need to be mentioned. After all, he had seen many of Art Saint Qin Zhao's handwriting. After seeing it and thinking about it, he could imitate it pretty well. At this time, whether it was the handwriting left on the Zhu arch or the one left on the cabinet door, it wasn't his but Qin Zhao's. And the tone of those words was very similar to Qin Zhao's. When Zhou Xian said this, Li Yunxin suddenly stopped laughing. He stopped smiling and turned to look at Zhou Xian. His tone became serious. But this isn't enough. So, I have another thing to ask you. As he spoke, he flattened the cabinet door with one hand and put the other hand on it. He stared at Zhou Xian. What does Qin Zhao look like? Zhou Xian was stunned. Then he realized what Li Yunxin was going to do. He hesitated for a moment and said, Okay. However, this method of yours might not necessarily work. Qining actually looks a bit flirtatious. Ordinary women would always have a flirtatious appearance and would always give off a frivolous and unrestrained feeling. But Qin Zhao, this person makes me feel that he's really smart. Li Yunxin interrupted him. Tell me the details. For example, what kind of eyes, what shape do they look like, whether the corners of the eyes are raised or lowered, whether there are any sleeping silkworms. Also, whether the nose is straight or narrow, whether there are spots or moles on the face. Don't get emotional when you talk about these. Zhou Xian blinked his eyes. You want to draw her image? That might not be able to fool the two wandering souls. You have to know that they. Li Yunxin spread his hands and tilted his head at him. Zhou Xian said, Okay. I'll do as you say. Qin Zhao's eyes. After all, he had been with Qin Zhao for 1,000 years. Naturally, they didn't see each other every day. Sometimes they would see each other 2 or 3 times a day, or sometimes only once in a few years. But he still remembered their faces. Now he was able to describe them in detail. As he spoke, he saw Li Yunxin use his sharp nails to gently scratch on the cabinet door. The technique wasn't the one commonly used in painting or in the current world. The lines were fine and messy, as if he was randomly smearing. But he was knowledgeable and slowly realized that Li Yunxin was trying to use this method to restore Qin Zhao's original appearance. Only a few people in Li Yunxin's previous world used this method. These people were called criminal sketchers. Before the technology was developed, they would listen to the victim's description of the suspect's appearance and draw a portrait that was strikingly similar to the victim. Li Yunxin had never done this before. But because of his previous profession, he had come into contact with many such people. People who worked in this profession needed his professional help slightly more often than others. But he wondered if they would be scared if they knew that the person they asked for help looked like this. But no matter what, he would also practice painting in this life. Art skills were often interconnected. Now that he had a solid foundation, he got good results on the first try. At first he was far from it. Li Yunxin didn't draw as well as he wanted. But after about 15 minutes, as Zhou Xian described more and more details, Li Yunxin's character looked more and more like it. Zhou Xian's eyes slowly lit up. He didn't know how many more interesting things Li Yunxin was hiding. Although it was hard to deal with when he went crazy, there were many times when he could surprise people. Just like that, almost an hour passed. So, a woman's appearance was engraved on the back of the cabinet door. Li Yunxin exhaled softly and tilted his head to examine it. Then he proudly showed it to Zhou Xian. How is it? Does it look like this? When he spoke, his joy was overflowing. It was unknown if he was happy because he had done something he had never done before, or because he finally knew what Qining looked like. Zhou Xian looked at it too. But he frowned and shook his head. That's not right. Li Yunxin stared. Huh. You clearly described it like this. Similar in appearance. But not in spirit. Zhou Xian sighed. The eyebrows and eyes are all right. But it lacks her lively temperament. You should know that temperament is very difficult to grasp. This time your craftsmanship was too strong. You pursued the resemblance too much, so the artistic conception is lacking. In my opinion, this is a small trick. Should be crazy. Li Yunxin ignored him and closed the cabinet door. He raised his hand and tapped a few spots on the back of Qin Ying's figure, drawing a few runes. Then he suddenly waved his hand and erased the image. For example, when he was in Qinghe County, he had drawn the 9th young master and summoned his virtual image. It was because he had carefully observed him and felt the flow of energy around him. Thus, the painting had some of the 9th young master's spiritual qi. So once he used it, the 9th young master's spiritual qi made the virtual image even more vivid. It was exactly the same as the 9th young master himself. As for the other masters in the world, the clay statues and portraits worshipped in the temples were painted with the spiritual qi of the true God. It was more or less the same. But he had never seen Qin Ying himself. So he used another method. First, he drew Qin Ying's appearance. Then he drew it purely as if it was a person he had created out of thin air, just like how he drew some strong men or gods. It looked dazzling, but it was all for show. It was just to scare people. This was the so-called illusion technique and smoke screen. He had left a few runes on the portrait to ensure that it could be projected. When he was done, he inserted the cabinet door into the ground. The cabinet used to store the treasures of the 2 wandering souls was naturally not ordinary. The cabinet door was like tofu under Li Yunxin's fingers. It was inserted into the black jade floor, but the black jade was like tofu. Just like that, he stood facing the door of the hall. Li Yunxin took a few steps back and pointed at the back of the cabinet door. Immediately there was a flash of green light. A figure appeared out of thin air. It was Qin Ying's appearance. Seeing this, Zhou Xian was a bit dazed. Previously, he had not felt anything when he saw the carvings on the cabinet door. Now that he saw the image, he realized that Li Yunxin was really amazing. Even he could not tell the difference between Li Yunxin and Qin Ying. Li Yunxin stared at the figure silently for a while. Suddenly he laughed strangely. Then he stretched out his hand and pointed forward. In a soft voice he said, "You're dead." This voice made Zhou Xian's body go numb. It sounded like he was shouting with his throat pinched. When he heard Qin Ying's shadow repeat it, he realized that Li Yunxin was teaching this thing to speak. But the voice was naturally different from Qin Ying's. So, they asked and answered again, slowly polishing the voice into Qin Ying's appearance. When everything was done, Li Yunxin turned around and unrolled the scroll. He drew something on the paper casually. The roe deer baby that had finished eating the human skin but was still hiding in the cabinet turned into a beam of green light and was sucked back. Then Li Yunxin said calmly, "Where are the other treasures of Cloud Mountain, Daotong and Kenzo?" Hearing this, Zhou Xian was moved. "What do you mean?" Li Yunxin smiled. "What do I mean? You don't think that I've endured for so long, used so many schemes and suffered so much, just to step on some flowers and plants, kidnap some rare animals and destroy some clothes?" He sneered again. "The other treasures of Cloud Mountain, the treasures left by the saints of Daotong and Kenzo as well as many pills, where are they? I've died a few times now and my demonic power is almost gone. Do you think I'm going to rely on myself to slowly cultivate, enjoy incense and spend hundreds or thousands of years to find them? Of course I still need to take pills." Zhou Xian frowned and stared at him. "Take pills? Do you know how many miraculous pills there are on Cloud Mountain? How are you going to take them? They all have different effects and uses. Although they all have spiritual power, if you eat them as pills to replenish spiritual power, it's like using the beautiful clothes of the mortal world to add fuel to the fire and boil water. It's like burning a zither and boiling a crane. How many do you need to eat to replenish your demonic power?" As he said this, his expression became serious. "If you want to take revenge on the 2 wandering souls, I won't say a word. But if you want to destroy the foundation of Cloud Mountain, I won't allow it. Chapter 503. From the moment Li Yunxin met Zhou Xian to the moment he spoke, this was the most serious this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had ever been. His expression changed almost instantly. His tone was firm and it seemed that there was no room for negotiation. So Li Yunxin squinted his eyes. His eyes used to be black and white. Now that he was squinting, his pupils instantly turned into a brilliant gold, with a thin black line in the middle. Coupled with his previous crazed look and the spacious and quiet atmosphere in the hall, people couldn't help but feel their hair stand on end. It was as if Li Yunxin had suddenly turned into a terrifying beast at this moment, about to devour people. The real master of calligrapher would not feel anything when he looked like this. But now this reincarnation of the master of calligrapher had a lot of emotions, and because of those emotions he was slightly shocked by his look. But then he sneered, "Li Yunxin, what? Do you want to turn against me? I know you are originally eccentric, but I always think this is also your outstanding point. I also know that your mind will be affected by these big changes, so I let you do many things." Zhou Xian stared at him seriously. At the same time he took 2 steps back. He was not showing weakness. He was seriously keeping a distance from Li Yunxin and preparing for something in case Li Yunxin suddenly attacked him. The current Li Yunxin was not the Li Yunxin outside the Cloud Mountain. Without any scruples, without any pressure, he had already revealed his true self. In the past he was wearing a human skin. No matter his appearance, character, or thinking, he was wearing a human skin. But now he seemed to have temporarily thrown away the skin. Zhou Xian could not tell what kind of existence Li Yunxin was at this moment. He was like a human but not a human, like a demon but not a demon. He was not even sure how to deal with him. If he was really a demon, he would naturally get rid of this demon as the reincarnation of the master of calligrapher. But he was not. He still had a lot of human energy. But to say that he was a human being, who could predict what he would do or say in the next moment. Zhou Xian frowned and continued, "But this matter is related to the fate of the world. The treasures on Little Cloud Mountain, what kind of treasures do you think they are in the treasury of a mortal emperor? Those so-called treasures were nothing more than playthings to look at. But which one of the treasures inside wasn't powerful enough to stir up a storm of blood the moment they appeared? It was fine to just talk about the functions of these magic treasures. But what do these treasures actually amount to? It's almost half of the foundation of the Celestial Gate. It was half of the foundation of the world's righteous path. Daotong and Kenzo's treasures. That's easy for you to say. But actually it's the most. At this point he paused twice. Because he really didn't know what to say. It was also because he had never had the chance to talk about such a thing before. To explain to a person the weight of the treasures left behind by the saints of Daotong and Kenzo over the past 50,000 years. Who dared, to ask such a thing? Zhou Xian simply couldn't believe that Li Yunxin dared to have designs on these things. He also couldn't believe that he actually wanted to explain to him, persuade him, and discuss with him to convince him. His words could be said to be sincere and well-intentioned. Who in the world had the face to be treated like this by the reincarnated body of a saint? But what about that Li Yunxin? He wasn't satisfied and didn't appreciate it. He actually laughed coldly and interrupted Zhou Xian. "Oh, in the end you just don't want to help me." After saying this he put away the scroll in his hand, tied it to his back and strode out of the hall. "If you don't want to help me, I'll look for it myself, room by room. I'll destroy them all and see if I can find it." Zhou Xian's face turned cold. "You dare?" Others fell for his trick, but Li Yunxin didn't fall for it. He laughed coldly 3 times and shot out like lightning. "You see if I dare or not?" Even though his monster power hadn't recovered, his strong body was still there. In just 2 breaths' time he jumped out of the door like an eagle rising from the ground, flipping over to the roof of the hall. Then he stomped on the roof, and like an arrow leaving the bow, he shot towards a 6-story exquisite pagoda in the northwest direction. There was only a waterside pavilion between this pagoda and the dome hall. The waterside pavilion floated on a round lake with shimmering water and green lotuses. It was a rare and beautiful scene. Li Yunxin descended from the sky and landed on the eaves of the waterside pavilion, stomping on it. The eaves immediately rumbled and a big hole appeared. He used the force of this stomp to jump up again, but he said, This is also the place where those two bastards go sightseeing. Let's see if there are any treasures hidden here. After saying this, he struck down with his palm in mid-air. Monster power gushed out. With a deafening sound, a perfectly good waterside pavilion exploded. The broken bricks and tiles flew in all directions, shooting far away. The surrounding green lotuses were smashed into smithereens. The originally clear water was also smashed by the falling wooden beams and rocks, turning muddy. The pitiful waterside pavilion was actually just a big octagonal pavilion with double eaves and a long corridor. There were no walls around, not even a curtain. What could be hidden? Zhou Xian knew that this Li Yunxin wasn't looking for treasures. He was obviously destroying everything he saw to vent his anger. He didn't know why he suddenly became so angry. Even though his tribulation body didn't have any divine powers, he could use divine powers. Seeing Li Yunxin's crazy look, he knew that he couldn't be arrogant anymore. Thus he shouted in a low voice, "You're too naughty." As soon as he finished speaking, he leaped up just like Li Yunxin and chased after him in the direction he had gone. In just a few leaps he was very close to Li Yunxin. He shouted again, "Li Yunxin, the restrictive spell on the mountain is still there. Do you really want me to use those methods to deal with you?" What he got was nothing else, but Li Yunxin had already leaped up to the top of the 6-story exquisite pagoda. He sneered at him again, "See if there's anything here." Then he suddenly plunged down. The whole pagoda immediately collapsed with a rumble. Thick smoke and dust gushed out from the windows of the pagoda, as if a giant god in the sky had thrown a stone at the top of the pagoda. In an instant, Li Yunxin used his strong body to pierce through the pagoda from top to bottom, smashing it. Smoke and dust filled the sky, quickly forming a mushroom cloud. In the next moment, a figure broke through the clouds and shot towards the southeast. Zhou Xian finally got angry. He didn't chase after Li Yunxin anymore. Instead he glanced down and saw a thin, craggy stone by the lake. He reached out and waved at the thin stone. Formation. Light appeared and spiritual energy surged. The surrounding area suddenly darkened, as if the sunlight was sifted through by an invisible sieve. Then he looked at Zhou Xian again. His hands and feet were plated with a layer of misty golden light, as if there was divine power attached to them. His feet slightly tapped in the air, and a 5-colored auspicious cloud lifted him up high into the sky. He stretched out his left hand again and a lot pot appeared in his palm. His face was as calm as water and his voice was like a great bell. "Li Yunxin, you want a magic treasure? I'll show you this one." Then he pointed at Li Yunxin in the distance with his right hand. 5th gate. Li Yunxin originally went straight to a huge 3-story palace with heavy eaves. The palace had big red walls and gold and jade tiles. It was surrounded by 3 white jade pillars, and there were 2 wide dragon and phoenix paths in front of the palace. It looked extremely majestic. If it was destroyed, it would definitely look even more majestic when it collapsed. But when Zhou Xian said those 3 words, it was as if he ran into an invisible barrier. He was only a few feet away from the top of the palace, but he couldn't fly over. Then 5 huge gods in bright armor appeared around him. They looked angry and raised their hands to catch him. Li Yunxin didn't even think and punched them. His whole body was about the size of the 5 gods' fists. However, the moment he punched out, the celestial being's body started to sway and was almost destroyed by him. The other 4 grabbed him tightly, restraining him. But Li Yunxin punched and kicked them again. In just 2 breaths' time, the 5 gods' bodies were destroyed, and they quickly turned into a golden light and disappeared. He laughed coldly. "This is your magic treasure?" Zhou Xian was neither happy nor angry. He sighed and hesitated for a while. Then he turned his finger. A lot flew out from the lot holder in his left hand. When the lot flew into the air, it immediately turned into hundreds of soldiers in golden armor, each holding a weapon, and charged at Li Yunxin. Li Yunxin shouted bravely in the air, "This kind of trash, no matter how many come, I will kill them all." As soon as he finished speaking, his arms suddenly lit up with electricity, and he charged straight into the formation. But when he defeated the 5 gods, it looked like he was playing around. Now it was a little more difficult to fight these hundreds of soldiers. After a quarter of an hour, all of them were blasted away, and his body was covered with cuts and bruises. Especially his face. After his rebirth, his face was thin and fragile. Now that he was in a forest of swords and spears, His face was full of blood and wounds and it looked very scary. But it was only scary to look at. She reached out and wiped her face, revealing the tender pink face underneath. He didn't even need to wash his face. Both spells failed, but Zhou Xian still didn't change his expression. Seeing that Li Yunxin was approaching him, he moved his fingers again, and 2 more lots flew out, turning into hundreds of soldiers that were the same as before. But this time it took Li Yunxin a lot more effort to kill them than last time. He had learned some martial arts since he was young, so his attacks were very methodical, and he didn't randomly punch and kick like the hooligans in the market. But when he killed them for the 3rd time, he gradually found that the soldiers formed by the golden light were actually a little similar to him. But before he just killed them casually, but now he was serious. In less than 15 minutes, this group was also cleared by him and he continued to charge at Zhou Xian. Okay, I will tie you up first and then I will find mine. Zhou Xian didn't change his expression and he turned his fingers 3 times. Then 3 more lots flew out of the lot pot in his left hand, turning into hundreds of heavenly weapons. Now looking at these hundreds of heavenly weapons, it was even more obvious. Not only were their fighting methods almost exactly the same as Li Yunxin's, even their originally blurry faces were very similar to Li Yunxin's. These heavenly weapons were getting more and more difficult to deal with. At this time, Li Yunxin was already fighting hard with 120% of his spirit, but he was still in a difficult situation. At this time, Zhou Xian said in a deep voice, "This magic treasure is called the Ruliao lot. If you use 1 part of your strength to give it, it will save 1 part of its strength. What kind of fighting method you use, it will slowly learn to fight in the same way. If you haven't reached the Grand Supreme Realm, it will eventually use the same kind of magical power you use. Li Yunxin, the more you fight now, the harder it will be to defeat it next time. Why are you still messing around?" But Li Yunxin was determined. He clenched his teeth and didn't say anything, only gathering his remaining courage, looking as if he was going to win again. So Zhou Xian sighed again, his fingers moving again. This time another 3 lots flew out. In the air they turned into 3 golden armored deities who looked more like Li Yunxin, 1 on the left, 1 on the right and 1 at the back. They flew through the crowd and grabbed Li Yunxin firmly. Li Yunxin tried to struggle but he couldn't break free for a while. This was bad. The heavenly generals who were fighting with him also turned into streams of light and entered the bodies of the 3 people. At this time he couldn't even move. At this time Zhou Xian's brows relaxed a little. He stared at Li Yunxin, who was gritting his teeth for a while, then said, "Li Yunxin, tell me, although you're not a kind person, you're not unreasonable either. But this matter, why are you so crazy? Everything you did before was to protect yourself. But now not only can you protect yourself, you're even taking the initiative. Tell me, at this time should you take these treasures? If you take these treasures, will the wandering souls of the Freemasonry chase you to the end? Is it possible to drag you out again?" Li Yunxin couldn't break free no matter how hard he tried, so he simply stopped moving. Now that he heard Zhou Xian ask these questions again, he sneered, "Yes. It's possible. So what?" Zhou Xian glared at him. "Then why do you have to do this? You want to save your demon generals? I can lead you to get soul return pills. You can take as many as you want. If you want demonic energy, I can lead you to get some pills. It's harmless to the body to eat them and it's not a waste to use them on you. But the treasures left behind by the saints on Cloud Mountain belong to the Taoist sect. Even if it's temporarily controlled by the Freemasonry, one day the Taoist sect will still be the Taoist sect. But if you take them away, can you guarantee that you can protect these treasures? Won't they fall into the hands of bad people?" "Can you?" Li Yunxin laughed heartily. "Huh. Bad people. To you, aren't the biggest bad people in the world those wandering souls? Keeping them in their hands. Is it better than keeping them in my hands?" Zhou Xian raised his eyebrows. "Cloud Mountain will recover one day. At that time this Cloud Mountain will still be the Taoist sect's Cloud Mountain. But if it leaks out, sigh." "Li Yunxin, are you playing dumb?" Li Yunxin suddenly laughed. "Good. You want to know what's wrong with me? I'll tell you now." Chapter 504. After laughing, he narrowed his eyes and stared at Zhou Xian. "It's because you said it too lightly. Recover Yunshan." Huh. The bodies of the 2 sages were destroyed. They wandered for thousands of years like lonely ghosts. Now they dare to sneak back with the help of a nobody like me. The Freemasonry has taken control of nearly half of the Dongtian school. The other half has either died or left. It's on the verge of collapse. Now the demons have attacked to the foot of Yunshan. It's almost a hopeless situation. Under such circumstances, even if Yunshan is defended, most of the Taoist priests and swordsmen are dead. Not to mention the whole world is divided and the foundation is shaken. Under such circumstances, you told me to recover Yunshan and not to touch those treasures. Let me ask you, where do you get your confidence from? Zhou Xian smiled and was about to speak. Li Yunxin looked at him fiercely. I'm just a pawn of yours, right? You're still hiding something from me. Zhou Xian blinked and the smile on his face slowly disappeared. They looked at each other for a while. Zhou Xian let out a sigh. Why do you say that? Do you think I'm a fool? Li Yunxin looked at him. The people of Munanju also used me and treated me as a pawn. But at least you didn't insult my IQ. You've done a good job of keeping up appearances. You carried me in a fancy sedan chair and called me Dragon King. What about you? Your other reincarnation, Su Weng, went to Dongting Lake in my dragon palace to rebuild a body for Lu Ling. Li Yunxin shook his head and laughed at himself. At that time I thought maybe you were a master of the Dongtian school. You wanted to save Lu Ling because you loved her. I even thought that Su Weng was the incarnation of the sage. Before Lu Ling got out of Yunshan, she was summoned to the two sages and was given many magic treasures. Maybe that was why the sage wanted to save her. But later I learned that the sage was long dead. Li Yunxin sneered. Since the saint is a wandering soul of the Freemasons, he won't save Lu Ling. Who is that Su Weng? After that, I met you and knew that Su Weng was indeed another reincarnation of you, the master of calligraphy. Moreover, the body he remolded for Lu Ling through my dragon palace is called the Six Desires Tribulation Physique. It's exactly what the two wandering souls of the Freemasons want at all costs. Then tell me, a mere Lu Ling actually required the tribulation body of a saint to personally deal with him. To use such a mysterious method to reconstruct her body. Who is this Lu Ling? Li Yunxin glared at him. You are the reincarnation of the sage of calligraphy. Then, where was Sword Saint Shuamuja's tribulation body? Don't you realize that ever since I met you, I've been asking all sorts of questions and never mentioned the Sword Saint's reincarnation? Do you think I'm a fool and have forgotten her? Zhou Xian frowned. After a moment of silence he said, I see. Alas. If I did that thing back then I wouldn't have done it like Su Weng. After all, the tribulation he went through was different from mine, so he did things more casually. But you said that I treated you as a fool because of that, which is also a criticism. Li Yunxin sneered again and interrupted him. What happened after that? Su Weng left a message saying that I sent her to live in seclusion and let her live as an ordinary person for the rest of her life. I didn't want to care about these things. But I thought that Su Weng might have a profound background and that Lu Ling had died in my hands before, so there was no irreconcilable enmity between us. So I sent her to Cui Gang. At that time I still thought that Su Weng did things according to his heart. Perhaps it's because an expert wouldn't understand the sufferings of an insignificant person. Lu Ling used to be a cultivator. Now she has become an ordinary person, but the foundation of cultivation is still there in her mind. Isn't this kind of person good material to be a wandering soul of the Freemasons? As a wandering soul, her cultivation will definitely improve by leaps and bounds. It would be strange if the Freemasons didn't catch her. Li Yunxin paused, but at that time I couldn't be bothered to care about it. After all, I didn't owe her anything or have any friendship with her. After that, she was indeed taken away by the Freemasons. So actually, you already knew that the Freemasons would do this. Am I right? You wanted the Freemasons to take Lu Ling away so that she could infiltrate their ranks. And you are now in Mount Shaoyun. The two of you actually have other plans, one inside and one outside. That's why you confidently told me about the restoration of Mount Shaoyun and how you can't let those things leak out. Because until now, you still regard the things on Mount Shaoyun as your private property. So you don't feel bad when I destroy the things of two wandering souls. But now that I'm going to destroy yours and take yours, you feel bad, don't you? His tone was very sharp when he said this. Zhou Xian listened to his words quietly. Then he sighed softly. These words of yours, Li Yunxin, I'm afraid you've hidden them in your heart for a long time. So it's precisely because of this that you think I'm using you. So when I told you not to take the magic treasure of Mount Shaoyun, you flared up? Li Yunxin snorted and laughed. The sound came from his chest, very dull. Do you know what I'm most upset about? He slowly calmed down. But his gradually turning golden eyes seemed to ignite a ball of fire. What I'm most upset about is, you people always think that I'm not worthy. I'm not worthy to participate in your game. Even though I'm already in the game, you still treat me as a chess piece. Those two wandering souls treat me as a chess piece. That person from Munanju keeps saying that he's my ally, but in fact he still treats me as a chess piece. As for you, Grandpa Calligrapher, you still treat me as a chess piece. Zhou Xian shook his head. The world is like a game. In this world, who isn't a chess piece? That's right. You people treat the world as a chess game. In this game, there are several chess players staring at each other, each with their own thoughts, using all the power they can to defeat the other party. From the beginning to the end, your vision is only focused on the opponent. As for the others, those who are used by you as chess pieces, you've never cared about them. Li Yunxin grinned, revealing her fangs that had become slightly sharper. For example, look at me now. What I'm most upset about is being looked down upon by you people. I've done so many things and settled so many things. But now I find that I'm actually just a step in the big picture of you and that Lu Ling. Your vision is on the Freemasonry, on the future. I'm just a chess piece in the eyes of you, Munanju, isn't that right? Zhou Xian frowned and looked at him. He didn't answer his question but said, Li Yunxin, you've forgotten yourself. You're very good at playing with people's hearts. Now, don't you know that your current mood and appearance are like a child's? Children in the secular world always want to be recognized by others. Once they've been ignored for a long time, they'll make a big fuss. Look at yourself now, isn't that the case? Li Yunxin immediately spat. So what if I am? I'll tell you the truth, I feel very wronged and upset. I'm upset about you and I'm also upset about Munanju. In addition, I really want to step all of you under my feet in the future, and then ask you if you feel that you've done wrong today, looking down on me like a snob. Zhou Xian shook his head and smiled faintly. I hope that day will come for you. But Li Yunxin, you can't do that today. Today you can be at ease for the time being. I'll bring you out of Little Cloud Mountain and bring your 2 demon generals with me. After that you can find a secluded place and quietly observe the changes here. Li Yunxin sneered again. Can't do it today? I'm going to take all the treasures today. Zhou Xian sighed as if he was looking at a willful child. Fine, fine, fine. Whatever you say. But before he could finish, he was suddenly interrupted. What interrupted him were 5 words. There were 3 groups in total. Horseshoe. Zhou Xian was stunned. Then he heard the second group, blossoming flower. He suddenly realized something and immediately moved his fingers. But the last word was read out before he could use it. God. Zhou Xian's expression suddenly froze and his body froze. Then the lot pot in his left hand suddenly turned into a spot of light and disappeared. The 3 demon generals that were restraining Li Yunxin also disappeared. Zhou Xian's body fell from the sky like a wooden stake, smashing into the ground and raising a large amount of dust. Li Yunxin narrowed his eyes and landed in front of him. In fact, Zhou Xian could now see Li Yunxin's boots, right next to his face. He could also see the tiniest dust on the boots and he could feel and understand everything in this world. But he couldn't control his reincarnated body. It was as if his consciousness was forced behind the scenes by some power, and he became a complete bystander. Li Yunxin lowered his head and looked at his face. After a while he said softly, Unfortunately, you didn't work in my line of work. It's also a pity that you people are too confident in yourselves. I guess you used to think that my methods weren't that big of a deal. You are just a reincarnated body. If you want to cut it, you will just have to go through the tribulation again. But if you were me, you would know that, don't give people like me a chance to play tricks in your head. Now listen to me. I will count to 3 and you will feel that I am a person worthy of complete trust. You will also feel that there is nothing wrong with leaving all the treasures on Cloud Mountain to me for safekeeping. Moreover, after I say goodbye to you, I will forget everything that has happened today as well as everything that has to do with me. Now listen to me. 3, 2. Zhou Xian took a deep breath and blinked like he was spasming for a while. He slowly climbed up from the ground. He looked confused as if he couldn't understand many things. He stared at Li Yunxin. What did you do to me? Li Yunxin tilted his head and stared at him for a while. He smiled. I brainwashed you. Just like what I did to you in the Qing army camp. Now let's get down to business. Where are the treasures and all kinds of spirit pills and miraculous medicines left behind by the saints on the floating mountain? Zhou Xian replied without hesitation, some are in the Qian Hall in the north. Others are in the Kun Hall in the south. Most of the pills are in the Qi Hall. There are restrictions and guards in all three places, but I know the way to break them. It isn't difficult to take things out. If you want to take them all, you can use the Linglong Pagoda inside to store them. The Linglong Pagoda can be big or small, so it is convenient for you to carry it on you. When he said these words, his tone was smooth and sincere. However, the expression on his face was extremely strange. As he spoke in this tone, his eyebrows were furrowed in anger. It was as if there was another him in his body that wanted to rush out and shut his mouth. Li Yunxin didn't care about his expression. He smiled. Take me there. Zhou Xian didn't hesitate and walked away. Just like this, the two of them walked for about a dozen steps. Zhou Xian suddenly stopped. The moment he stopped, Li Yunxin, who was behind him, immediately stepped back and at the same time dodged to the side. He dodged the incomparably sharp light that Zhou Xian raised his hand and swept behind him. This light brushed the bottom of his feet and flew out. It swept a distance of dozens of feet and rushed into the already muddy lake with a bang, stirring up waves that shot into the sky. If this had swept across Li Yunxin's body, he probably wouldn't be able to get up for a while and would be captured without a fight. However, he dodged it and laughed loudly. Good. You're a sage after all. You're used to face tribulations. This layer can't trap you. It only trapped him for less than the time it took for half an incense stick to burn. Now Zhou Xian turned around and his face was really angry. Li Yunxin. Although I hid something from you, I didn't want to hurt you. And now you are so stubborn about this matter with me. Today I am here and you can't take anything away. Now the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher was really angry. When he looked at Li Yunxin before, he only thought that he was an interesting junior and a willful kid. Most of the time he tolerated and indulged Li Yunxin. At least he thought that was the case. He wouldn't really get angry because of Li Yunxin's actions. But now, it seemed that someone had done something to his brain. How could he tolerate this kind of thing? As soon as he finished speaking, he didn't do anything. Instead, he flew to the north. Li Yunxin knew what he was trying to do with one look. This reincarnation had a strong body, but it didn't have any supernatural power. It could only be borrowed. But borrowed things might not be useful in fighting. It was better to use the magic treasures and formations that were set up on Cloud Mountain like what he did just now. Now that he was going to the north, there must be a strong restriction formation in the north. How could he let him get what he wanted? He sneered and chased after him. Of course, he didn't know where the formations were set up. But there was another way. Destroy everything you saw that was suspicious. Not to mention supernatural power, Li Yunxin's Longjia was stronger than the reincarnation of the sage of calligrapher. Everywhere the two of them passed, the pavilions, palaces and halls were all reduced to ruins. Zhou Xian seemed to be afraid of falling into Li Yunxin's trap again. When he flew to the north, he tore off 2 pieces of his clothes and stuffed them into his ears, pretending to be a deaf person. Along the way they destroyed everything. In just a dozen breaths' time they ran for several miles. Then he saw an incomparably huge ornamental watch. This Chinese watch stood on a big square like a needle on a sundial. However, this needle was over 100 feet tall and as thick as a dozen people's arms. It was strange. When they were far away they couldn't see anything. They could only see that the square was empty and there were no buildings. But once Li Yunxin followed Zhou Xian and stepped into the square, the huge Chinese watch suddenly appeared, as if it jumped out from some space. At this moment he knew something was wrong. Looking at the golden light on the Chinese watch, it must have an amazing spiritual power. And it appeared so suddenly, Zhou Xian must have calculated that he couldn't see it and wanted to lead him in. But it was too late when he wanted to retreat. A slight buzzing sound was heard and a huge light shield appeared above the square, covering the two of them. Zhou Xian didn't hesitate and waved at the Chinese watch. Formation. There were embossments on the Chinese watch. On the pillar there was a monster that looked like a dragon but not a dragon, like a fish but not a fish. Other than this monster there was also a crane. It was beside the monster that looked like a fish but not a dragon. And, even though Li Yunxin was shocked and panicked, he still noticed Zhou Xian's gaze. When Su Xing saw the Chinese watch, he was happy that Li Yunqing was lured here. Then he was surprised that the appearance of the Chinese watch had changed. But at this critical moment, Li Yunqing didn't think too much, and neither did Su Xing. So, the room fell into an awkward silence. Li Yunqing wanted to leave, but he couldn't. Su Xing waved his hand, but the Chinese watch didn't move. The formation he mentioned didn't respond to him. The two of them stared at each other for a moment. Then Li Yunqing turned around and pounced at him. Su Xing retreated to the side of the Chinese watch and flicked the pillar. A burst of golden light shone, and the two embossments on the Chinese watch suddenly became lively, as if they were about to come out. Su Xing shouted, "Go!" The two figures immediately broke free from the Chinese watch and fell to the ground. Li Yunqing didn't know whether the two figures that Su Xing summoned from the Chinese watch were divine beasts that were used to form a formation. So when he saw the two figures coming towards him, he waved his palms and was about to attack them. But at this critical moment he saw the faces of the two figures clearly. He grunted and retracted his strength. The wind from his palms brushed past the two figures' shoulders and exploded to the side. The two figures were not strangers. They were Bai Yunqing and Hong Yangzi. The three of them bumped into each other and fell to the ground in a tangled mess. Taking a breather, Su Xing flicked the Chinese watch again. The huge Chinese watch that was more than 100 feet tall immediately turned into a small flagpole and fell from the air into his hand. He held the treasure firmly, then heaved a sigh of relief and turned to look at the three people on the ground. "I was wondering why this demon execution banner didn't listen to me. Turns out that it sealed the two of you." As he said this, he held the treasure in his hand again, but he didn't attack again. As he was slightly shocked. There were very few things that could shock the sage of calligraphy, and now he had encountered one. The demon execution banner in his hand was not the most powerful among the treasures of the Xianmen, but it was the most famous. But it was not famous because of its outstanding military achievements, but because of a big demon. The first big demon in the Grand Supreme Realm, the Golden Rock King. This magic treasure was originally refined because the Golden Rock had become a big demon in the Grand Supreme Realm. So the sage wanted to keep it, so he refined it. Unfortunately, before this thing was used, the Xianmen and the Golden Rock had a tacit understanding. It was born for the Grand Supreme Demon, but it had never been used. Therefore it was later set up in this square, and could be considered one of the major formations of the mountain. Just now, when Su Xing reached out to summon it, it didn't listen. There were two possibilities for this situation. One was that it was broken. The other was that it was carrying a weight that it couldn't bear. Now he knew that it was the second possibility. This demon execution banner had sealed Red Lady and Bai Yunqing. All the spiritual power in the banner was used to suppress these two demons, so it had no time to listen to the summons. Problem was, Bai Yunqing was in the true realm. To this demon execution banner, she was just a sesame seed on a cattail leaf fan. How could he ask this magic treasure to use all the spiritual power? Then the strange thing was with Red Lady. Su Xing knew that there was a dragon soul sealed in her body. But since the dragon soul was sealed, it meant that it was similar to a dead object. For example, fruits and seeds. The weight was there, but you couldn't say that it was a fruit tree or a flower. The dragon soul was similar. For example, when a person was alive, these bones and flesh formed a person, and you could call it a person. But when it died, the flesh and blood were still flesh and blood, and it could only be called a corpse. The dragon soul in Shinryu's body was considered a dragon soul. But it was separated and sealed, and it couldn't be fused or revived, so it became a dead object. There were many secrets involved in this, and it was very mysterious. He could only think about it roughly at the moment. Then Red Lady, who had the dragon soul sealed, was just a red lady with a dead object. Or a small transformative state fish spirit. But this demon execution banner didn't listen to his summons and was suppressed by these two demons. Su Xing was startled. He stared at Hong Yangzi without saying anything. At this time, Li Yunqing had already stood up. He hesitated for a while and reached out to pull Bai Yunqing and Red Lady up. The two demonesses looked to be in a rather sorry state at this moment. They looked very weak. The demon-slaying banner was a treasure that could borrow strength to fight strength. It absorbed the demon's demonic power and used it to restrain the demon's body. It was similar to the bright stick that Su Xing had used to deal with Li Yunqing. In reality, the two of them were indeed components of another Tao artifact. Therefore they had been restrained by their own power for many days and they were exhausted. Bai Yunxin seemed to be in good spirits. As soon as she got free and stood up, she immediately stared at Zhou Xian with her black eyes and shouted, "Damn Taoist! How dare you capture me?" Her voice was sharp and high-pitched and it made people's heads go numb. But with such momentum there was nothing she could do. This floating mountain had sealed off her supernatural powers. She also saw the demon-slaying banner in Zhou Xian's hands and didn't know his actual strength, so she restrained her demonic temperament and didn't make a move. Looking at Red Lady, she didn't look good. Chapter 505. Her face was pale and her cheeks were sunken. She used to be a beautiful woman, but now she was as haggard as a withered willow that had been beaten by the wind and rain. But she was still conscious. She stood in front of Li Yunxin and stared at him with squinted eyes for a while before she could see his face clearly. Then she was stunned for a while, like an old man with a confused mind, before she opened her mouth. Li Lang. After saying this, she couldn't stand still. Her body softened and she was about to fall into his arms. She wasn't putting on an act like other women. And it seemed that she really couldn't make it. When Li Yunxin saw her in the palace of hatred, his mind had been eroded by the dragon soul. Now after these days it looked even worse. He subconsciously reached out to hold her, but in the end he dodged to the side and only held her. After holding her, he put his shoulder into Bai Yunxin's arms. "Take care of her. I still have things to do." Bai Yunxin stared at him. "Do you think I am? Did you kidnap her?" Li Yunxin looked at Zhou Xian and walked slowly while saying to Bai Yunxin, "Besides, you have been collecting flood dragon meat for so many years. Don't you know her well? Since you've kidnapped him, shouldn't you have a start and an end?" Bai Yunxin heard his words and shouted again, "Li Yunxin." After saying this, he looked at Red Lady. "This little fish is going to die. If you leave like this, you won't be able to see her again." Li Yunxin frowned and glanced at Red Lady. "If I stay here, she will also die. I went to get some precious elixir, maybe it can save her life." Bai Yunxin wanted to say something. But Red Lady seemed to have a terminal lucidity. She temporarily regained her consciousness and happened to hear Li Yunxin's words. She said in Bai Yunxin's arms, "Li Lang, you go. I know you still have important things to do. It's a pity." Having said this, she fell into a stupor again, as though a veil were drifting over her brain, and would give her only a limited time to speak to the person of whom she had been thinking day and night. If it was someone else who saw her like this, perhaps their heart would soften and they would chat with her. But it had to be Li Yunxin. In many people's eyes, Li Yunxin didn't have any emotions in his heart. Everything he had was to be used. However, the current Lu Gongzan might have a different opinion. If Lu Gongzan saw this scene, he would probably shake his head. His brother Exin, just as he had said, did not like to speak his mind to others. Even if, now he really felt a trace of pity for this Red Lady and a trace of indistinct feelings. However, it would also make him avoid her even further. This was because this kind of emotion would always make him subconsciously panic. It seemed that he still hadn't learned how to grasp and control it. Perhaps because of this, an invisible and untouchable art saint that only existed in history and clues could become some kind of emotional sustenance for him. Because of this, he didn't need to face such a person. Thus, Li Yunxin only vaguely responded with an N. Red Lady slowly came back to her senses and continued what she had just said. She said in a low voice, "Sai, it's a pity. When my father saw me for the last time, he told me that maybe I could help you in the future. Who knew that I would only become a burden now? If I can really help you, Lang." She turned to look at Zhou Xian and weakly raised her finger to point at the demon execution banner in his hand. "That banner suppresses the dragon soul in my body. It's already stagnant. I guess it's of no use now. You have to be careful. Come back soon." At this point, Zhou Xian subconsciously glanced at the demon-slaying banner in his hand. It was also at this moment that Li Yunxin suddenly launched an attack and fiercely pounced towards him. In an instant the two of them collided. Zhou Xian originally wanted to trap Li Yunxin, and Li Yunxin originally wanted to catch up to him. Now that the two of them were in the same restriction, it could be considered as a close combat. However, the two of them didn't want to kill each other. Li Yunxin wanted to get the method to break the restriction of the 3 halls from him. Su Xing didn't have any big grudges with him, but they were friends. Although Li Yunxin was stubborn, it wasn't good to kill him unless it was absolutely necessary. At least, he was a dragon son who could use some supernatural powers in this restriction. If they really fought to the death, it was really unknown who would be the winner in the end. Therefore, after another 3 breaths, the huge restriction that enveloped the square suddenly dissipated. Su Xing broke it, withdrew to avoid Li Yunxin's attack, and turned to the east as if to find another restriction. Li Yunxin naturally chased after him. Therefore, wherever the 2 of them passed, they raised a large amount of smoke and dust, as if there was an angry giant beast running wildly in this floating mountain. It really didn't know how many strange landscapes and precious treasures were destroyed. When the 2 of them came, they were like a gust of wind. After a short pause, they also left like a gust of wind. Bai Yunxin stared at the direction the 2 of them went for a while, and then lowered her head to look at Red Lady in her arms. The fish spirit's body was completely limp, and she was relying on Bai Yunxin to hold her. He Yao sighed and slowly sat on the ground, letting Red Lady lie down with her legs as a pillow. Then he stared left and right at her face for a while and said, "You are really stupid. But I don't blame you. Who told you to be a cultivator?" She said this and then gritted her teeth. "Don't blame me for taking you away. At that time your Dongting, your father was also gone, and a group of demons and people of Xianmen were eyeing you covetously. It was not a good situation for you to stay there. I took you away for your own good." But Red Lady just stared at her. She didn't know whether she heard it but had no strength to speak, or she didn't hear it at all. Bai Yunxin was silent for a while and then said, "Alas. In the words of human beings, you also have a hard life. Your monarch father treats you like a plaything. I don't even know why he gave birth to you. Speaking of this, my adoptive father." "Humph. But my adoptive father was better than your father. He refined the dragon soul in you. What did he think you were? I have taken the flood dragon meat from you all these years. Although we are not close friends, I know this kind of thing and I also feel unfair." Red Lady opened her mouth and no one knew what she said. But Bai Yunxin didn't try to listen to it carefully. She was talking to Red Lady now, which looked like a sister in the secular world, complaining and chatting. But she was not a woman in the secular world, but a demon who would slaughter the whole city if she was not happy. Now she said this to Red Lady just because she wanted to say it, but not mainly to feel for Red Lady and comfort her. There was a subtle but huge difference between them and the people in the secular world. Therefore she didn't hear it clearly and she didn't bother to listen. She just touched Red Lady's face and continued, "I said you are stupid. Lass, are you stupid or crazy? You can't forget Li Yunxin, but look at him just now. When he was about to leave, he didn't even look at you. Little fish, do you think he knew that when he came back he would only see a corpse?" After a long time, Red Lady opened her mouth again, making some meaningless syllables. But Bai Yunxin couldn't hear what she was saying. She sighed pitifully for a while and then said, "Forget it. Li Yunxin doesn't care about you, let me try." After saying this, she was about to get up and help the fish spirit up. But she was stunned, because she realized that the Red Lady who was lying on her lap had already died at some point in time. There was no vitality and her breath was cut off. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.